I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello, and welcome to the wonderful and strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the freaky alien baby to my lady in the radiator.
Wow! Wow! Wow!
Oh no, a dinosaur's eating my baby!
I want to go lower pitch because I didn't want to ruin our listeners' ears, you see, Kalil, because you gave me a task I could only die in.
Well, clearly David Lynch did not mind ruining our ears and our eyes with his latest film, 1977's Eraserhead.
Sometimes at the same time.
Thank you very much, person.
Baby.
I don't think you ever said who you are. So I'm Kalil.
I'm DaBaby.
DaBaby is like an American music artist.
I'm...
Who are you?
Emotionally, I'm the Unplugged Professor.
Thank you. Emotional logic is what we're operating on tonight.
But I'm still physically DaBaby.
We're gonna fuse excessive logical readings along with pure emotional thought as well.
Now, as far as this goes, listener, hey, Eraserhead, this is something that's a little bit different, just like our last episode over the short films. If you want to check out Eraserhead, might I suggest the Criterion Collection. We are not sponsored by them, but the Criterion Collection, where you can find a film like this.
So we watched it initially on the Criterion channel, as well as then later for our second viewing on the Blu-ray release for it. If you're interested in watching Eraserhead, that's a good location to find said film. So, spoiler warnings out in effect potentially for Twin Peaks. We might say something about Twin Peaks now and then that'll be spoilery for the entire Season 1 and Season 2, as well as Fire Walk will be missing pieces, as well as spoilers for the short films. I'm sure we'll be talking about those as we continue along, since there's a lot of parallels and similarities between Eraserhead and many of the short films, most notably, I would say, The Grandmother.
Oh, yeah. yeah. The Grandmother, you know, the short film we saw last time. Hey, listeners, little update here. We decided that, hey, maybe we should check this out on the Blu-ray. You know, maybe we can see the image closer. And we didn't think to ourselves, it probably isn't that much of a difference. It was all the difference. It was most certainly all the difference because we saw something inside of the darkness. Kalil, go ahead, Kalil, if you will. I know you are a wordsmith of words now.
So you're referring to, just to make sure we're on the same page, you're referring to the ending scene, the last shots of Eraserhead with the boy, the grandson, doing the Christ pose over the bed, something manifesting over his head, and now he may or may not be dead.
You see, this is why you're a wordsmith of words, because you are able to clarify things a lot
that's what
easier.
You said.
So, wordsmith, please tell us more
about...
Well,
maybe he peed or maybe he bled, but there's something definitely in that bed. And with this ring ivy wed, a certain sort of feeling of confused. Okay, I'm done. No, there was something really, really hard to make out on the TV, and we went through TV calibration last time and this time, and I thought we were calibrated properly. Maybe we weren't, or maybe the Blu-ray is what we needed. But even just a difference, I would say, from watching this on the Criterion channel, the Blu-ray showed us way more of the thing on top of the boy. It doesn't make it clear.
On top of the boy or from within the boy?
Either one, it is sprouting directly above boy. It looks very plant-like. It looks very much similar to the creature or plant that spouted out the grandmother earlier.
Except a lot more like stark white. I would almost call it like a deep fungus or some sort of coral reef, maybe?
Yeah, a little more corally, fungally. There's also those little tendrils we talked about, like creeping in from the corners. There's more of them now.
There's more of them.
They're very much creeping toward, which I don't know about you, but I thought that really changed the tone. It was already menacing before. Now it seems more directly perilous for the boy, right? Like, this seems more clearly like something's got a hold of him. I don't know. I mean, you could maybe read a happy ending out of this. I certainly don't. What about you, Professor?
I'm scared.
I really enjoy the ending. I don't know which version I like better. I guess it's still unclear what it is, so I don't feel like the illusion has been broken seeing more of it. I almost feel like this is A question for me, if I'd want to know what David Lynch wants. Did David Lynch want us to view this thing more clearly like the Blu-ray has it? Or did he want it to be more obscured the way that the DVD had it? If it was an unfulfilled wish that he wished it was clearer, well then the new version of it is the superior version by creator intent at least.
Well, Kalil, as far as things like special features we explored on the Blu-ray, I don't think that even if we asked David Lynch himself, we would have an answer that was clear, even though he was being honestly clear.
I'm very glad that you're starting to pick up on that about David Lynch.
Yay.
He do be like that.
He do be like that.
So we're going to talk about Eraserhead in full detail here. Sometimes we'll dive into the characters, the plot setting, just kind of in loose order we have here. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, the itty-bitty, the slimy squishy, question for you, Professor.
Answer.
What was your general opinion of this film entitled Eraserhead?
This is something that I feel is very much a gallery of intention and images that I can see appeal for many and a deterrent for others. For you, was it a deterrent or an appeal? Appeal. I can't say whether or not I personally like the film, mainly because I feel that it's very much grasps onto David Lynch's desire to make things such as a painting, if you will, through the active use of cinema. Mm-hmm. So, very similar to the painting we saw with Six Men Getting Sick, the overall feel of something like The Grandmother. It seems that we're exploring this, but more kind of in between.
Do you feel like all the short films were like that for you as well, or were there any short films that broke out of that for you?
I would say the closest thing to Twin Peaks was probably The Frenchman and The Cowboy.
Closest thing chronologically as well as tonally.
Yes. I would say that another different one would have been the one at the end.
What did Jack do?
Oh.
Fire Posar? Pierre and Sonny Jim?
Yes. All of those are very different from where we're at now.
I think Pierre and Sonny Jim is an art piece in its own right.
I think that the closest one would probably be Fire Posar, but even that, I feel that David Lynch has grown a lot with his overall art style, that things have shifted a bit more. This still feels like early Lynch, in which, say for example, Fire Posar feels like a 3D image. We're looking at a 2D image right now.
That is really interesting, consider that it's literally the opposite.
Exactly.
That Fire Posar is definitely more two-dimensional than Eraserhead.
I know, but it feels right to say. I do know that this is probably just adding more questions.
So you enjoyed your experience.
Yes.
But you were hesitant to rate it as a film.
Yes.
If you were to view it in line with the other short films, would this be one of your favorite short films, or toward the middle, or toward the bottom?
Towards the upper half.
Upper half.
The upper crust.
2/3? Top third?
Top third.
Okay, sounds fair enough. Not quite as good as The Frenchman, The Cowboy and the Frenchman.
Stop insulting me to my face.
Well, do you mind if I share mine as well? My opinion, my words?
Yeah, by all means.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
So, I saw this movie first when I was in high school. This was my first ever David Lynch experience. I saw it when I was about 16 or 17. We had this project to do for my AP psychology class where we had to watch 3 movies, and then for each one of them write like a 1-page report connecting like terms we've learned in class to the movie. Mm-hmm. And I had this friend who had the project with me from the same class, and she was like, hey, there's this weird movie called Eraserhead. I've never seen it. You've never seen it. We're both doing this project. Let's do our paper on this. And it worked pretty well. I mean, it was really easy to like attach terms like dissociation and phobias onto this movie. But it was also a very funny task as like a 16 or 17-year-old trying to articulate very, very briefly what this is and how it connects to these very like clear terms from a class.
Yes.
Since this movie doesn't really operate that literally way.
The form of it is confusing because it's not exactly something I would naturally see. But then again, you've explored more art house than I have. I'm still open to art house, but you have explored far more of it.
And I'm not, by no means though am I like an expert at that. It's just an interesting area for me. I was kind of thinking about this too and talking to you off pod about it though. Even though, I've seen more art house films, it's typically more my wheelhouse as far as film go. Mm-hmm. I still feel like this is a movie that no time period would it have been normal. Like, part of me wants to say it's so impressive to see this being made in 1977.
Yeah.
But then I'm also like, well, what time period this coming out would it have been a normal thing? If this was a brand new movie released now, it would still be really strange for a new director who's only made a few short films to just like release this.
There was like a 30-minute period between 1999 and 2000 that it was like at that standard mode, but unfortunately Eraserhead was too long, so it didn't quite fit.
And if someone released it now, the immediate thing they would say, it's like, oh, it's like David Lynch, because that's all we'd have to understand it, and Lynch didn't exist before David Lynch. So, anyway.
As far as evidence shows now.
As far as evidence, time travel, maybe.
Maybe.
So, as far as my overall opinion, I know I've kind of strayed from the path here. I really enjoy Eraserhead. It's like a solid 4.5 out of 5, 9 out of 10 for me. It doesn't have the sort of magical allure that it maybe initially had because I've gotten more used to it. And I don't want to say I understand this film. I think that that's a bit limiting. I don't think this film has only one interpretation.
Yes.
It is super abstract. But I feel like I understand the basic movements of the story a lot better than I did when I was younger. And I also feel like in viewing it in terms of other Lynch projects, you start to notice these themes, you start to notice these ideas where it's still weird, it's still wonderful and strange, but it starts to follow more of a pattern. It makes more sense in the totality of Lynch's work. I really like this movie. I really think it fits in as one of David Lynch's strongest like single works. If someone would never seen anything by David Lynch and they wanted to watch one thing to get an idea of him, I still think this wouldn't be a bad route to take, especially if you wanted to give him one thing to show them what Lynch was like when he first started.
Okay.
This takes a lot of the ideas in the short films, especially things like The Alphabet and The Grandmother, and puts it into one cohesive whole. Cohesive is a word we'd use for this, right? It feels very like compact in a certain way. Like there's no wasted scenes.
Yes.
And it feels like this is self-contained. Like this feels like a complete work to me.
Yes, it feels complete enough, and though that there are no wasted scenes inside of here, we do know that there were scenes lost into the cosmos, if you will.
Now, as far as content warnings go, this isn't a very graphic film directly, although it does clearly allude to topics of a sexual nature.
Yes.
It's one of the less violent David Lynch works, I would say. But if you are someone who's in a position where you don't really want to watch a movie that has gratuitous symbolism involving sperm, probably not for you. But I wouldn't call it a family film, but I don't find this to be that offensive. Congratulations.
It is still something, however, very grotesque. There's a lot of practical effects going on that are very uncomfortable.
Yeah, there was one in particular that we'll get to later that you even were a little squeamish about second time watching.
Yes, if you do not like the sight of, say, for example, blood, ooze, mashed potatoes, and...
the gravy especially.
Yes.
This is a mashed potatoes and gravy kind of movie.
It is very much, but in the worst way.
And I would almost argue the most affronting thing about it is the sound design.
And pimple.
And pimple.
Yep.
It's like this and Osmosis Jones. If you were to do like a Venn diagram of the things they have in common, pimple would be in the middle of that Venn diagram.
But regardless, with both films, I both enjoy at the end of the day, and I do recognize is gross at moments.
And I would specifically recommend this film to Osmosis Jones fans.
I don't.
I think there's a good overlap here.
I don't. So, yeah, forewarning onto those if you decide to check out Eraserhead yourself afterwards, or if it is something which you don't want to comfortably hear about, especially the squishiness. There are also themes we discuss, such as potential murders of babies and suicide.
And then one last item, I guess, on our to-do list before we start deep diving would be that there's going to be some trivia in this episode. Some background information. By no means, again, is this exhaustive. I did go through the Criterion Collection special features and absorb some information from that, which, by the way, there's some great interviews, trailers, interesting situations we're only going to lightly touch on that if you haven't explored yourself, they're a good time.
I don't want to visualize you absorbing information. that sounds...
mashed potatoes. And then also there's some IMDb and David Lynch wiki information contributed here as well.
Very good.
So Eraserhead had a pretty troubled production.
You don't say.
Wouldn't say. The script originally started, if you want to think of it this way, as a separate project called Gardenback or Greenback. I've seen it written both ways. In my notes it says Greenback. I'm pretty sure it's Gardenback. Point being...
either way, I don't see these in the film.
There was an original script that was based on a certain painting of David Lynch's, and it's actually one of my favorite David Lynch paintings.
Okay.
It's of this kind of hunched figure. There's like plant life growing on his back. And it's kind of this, again, strange, as you might imagine, imagery from David Lynch's visual art.
Okay.
It reminds me a lot more of the Grandmother type of art style, if you want to think of it that way.
Okay.
The script was sort of a surrealist take on adultery, where it was going to have this sort of continuously growing insect representing in some way the man's lust for his neighbor. Now, this idea of lusting for the neighbor, adultery, that would make its way in Eraserhead, but not necessarily be like the main focus, obviously. Potentially. Unless you want to read it that way. It was about a 45-minute type of project, so a little longer than The Grandmother, but not by much, and it got rejected, largely because at this point, they were looking for something a little bit more substantive if you're going to make a whole film out of it. It was kind of the situation of length of runtime versus content. It wasn't necessarily received very well.
Okay.
In 1971, David Lynch moved to L.A. for his degree at the AFI, the American Film Institute.
Very well.
And he got a $10,000 grant to make what eventually became Eraserhead.
Okay.
Now, throughout this whole process of several years that are going to take place, he would exhaust that $10,000 and need to scrounge for money.
How did he scrounge?
Well, a lot of the crew had to give income from their other jobs. So David Lynch himself for a few years, he worked as like a paper boy and like had a certain route he would take and like fine-tuned it to like a speed run of like an hour each night. He would use all of his money from that pretty much.
Okay.
And then Catherine Coulson, also known as the Log Lady in Twin Peaks,
yes,
as well as the amputee from The Amputee.
Yes.
She served as kind of an executive director on the whole project,
okay,
and she was contributing, if not all, but a lot of her income as a diner waiter, I believe, a diner waitress.
Cool.
And then we also saw Jack Fisk, who played the Man in the Planet, kind of the grotesquerie inside of The Rock.
Yes.
He and his wife also donated a lot of money to the project.
Huh.
So it was a lot of scrounging. And during this time, like, David Lynch went through a divorce about midway through this, where he was at times like living on the set illegally, kind of.
Yeah.
And there were moments where
kinda illegally.
Yeah, don't worry about it. And then he would also just like crash at Jack Nance's place because Jack Nance at that time was married to Catherine Coulson, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a whole lot of like just needing to get by and scrape by ends meet in a very tough financial situation that they were all perilously put through.
Yes.
The script itself was also strange in that it only was about 20 pages long. So given that this is a full feature-length film, there wasn't really a lot of dialogue or a lot of necessary directions. And given what we saw in the film, I think it's clear why that ended up being the case.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever Lynch would try to go up to people and propose his ideas to get funding, a lot of people would look at him and be like, this is not a legitimate film. Mm-hmm. So there's like this whole story I read about where it was involved with Terrence Malick, who's a very famous director. Mm-hmm. And Malick himself, I couldn't find if he liked the film idea or if he was just kind of sympathetic to his friend or someone he kind of knew from AFI.
Yes.
But Terrence Malick had tried to hook him up with someone to get him like a bit of a loan, but more financial help. Okay. And the guy who was involved then from Terrence Malick was kind of just there for a little bit, saw the footage they had, and basically called it BS. It was just ridiculous, terrible, and like walked out on it. And I have a feeling that's kind of the general tone for a lot of this. When you go to financiers, this was just not taken as a very big deal. And even to the extent of the cast, nothing wrong with what she was doing, but we saw Charlotte Stewart, who plays Mary in this movie.
Yes.
When she was first interviewed for it, she just kind of assumed it was like a small little student film, like a student art film.
Okay.
So I imagine for those even coming into the project, they didn't know, this is going to consume 5 years of my life.
Yay.
I'm going to be spending nearly every night in this weird barn making this weird film. And to be fair, it wasn't bad. Like, they actually really remember it fondly. They had a great time. It's one of David Lynch's probably favorite films to have worked on.
Okay.
But it took him longer than any other film. And it was clearly such a labor of love that love dragged its corpse through the whole process.
Yes.
In general, it was a really small crew behind the scenes. We had David Lynch obviously writing and directing and doing a lot of the miscellaneous work on the sound department as well.
Yes.
We had Catherine Coulson taking up random positions. She's an assistant to the director, but that involved like cooking. That involved like making sure everyone was doing what they needed to do. That involved her like setting up Jack Nance's hair because again, they were married. So she would like be the one to help keep his hair in that frizzy style for like 5 years. She just did everything on the side. Like unsung hero kind of thing.
Can you imagine having hair like that for 5 whole years?
It'd be fun.
It would? Okay.
I mean, I assume it wasn't all the way floofed up during the day, but it was able to be floofed up on a short notice kind of situation.
The partial floofs or whenever it's the days off.
We had Doreen Small on production and prop design, which again, this movie is really important for the production of props.
Yes.
That's a big deal. And then Alan Splett on sound. I'm going to praise him a lot, I think, if not in quantity and quality of praise, because I think this is one of those rare films where sound design is one of the best things about it. It's definitely just incredible sound design, and it was mostly Alan Splett working in conjunction with Lynch. And then cinematographers. We had, at first, Herbert Cardwell, who, in my research, I was seeing accounts that I think are just rumors that said that he, died mid-production.
Oh.
And then got replaced by this other guy. But then the way that the other guy worded it in an interview 2014 was that Herbert had to leave the project. It didn't say died.
Well, that is a form of leaving.
That is a form of
project.
leaving. So I didn't put together the whole timeline here. I could have done a little more research on that. But suffice to say, we had two different cinematographers. One was Herbert Cardwell, and then later Frederick Elms took over. From what I understand, they overlapped for a brief period of time where Herbert kind of tutored Frederick on what this film's ethos was, and then Herbert had to leave the project for one reason or another. But essentially, you're looking at a team of 5 or 6 people doing everything. And even the cast, there's not a lot of actors in this movie either. Everyone's either someone's relative or someone's best friend basically involved in this.
Or a puppet.
To get an idea of how long this movie took to make, there's a situation where Jack Nance is recalling one of the production moments, and he said, quote, "Henry's sitting on the edge of the bed, and he gets up to walk through the door, and it's a year and a half later before he comes out the other side, and it matches." So you would have takes where between one shot to the next, it'd be a year and a half and real time had passed. Now, the film wasn't shot necessarily all in order, and what did you think? I thought it was really seamless. I never caught myself thinking, wow, people look so different all of a sudden or something.
No, I do not see much of a difference, even down to, again, the hair.
I would never have guessed this film had been pieced together over 5 years.
Yeah, it seems like it is frozen inside of a singular point of time.
There's also a deep sense of trust among the cast and crew for David Lynch's vision, which is a recurring theme throughout his film work, but since at this point all he'd really done was a few short films, this was such a big project that everyone taking on their hours of their lives, but also their money, their dedication, their blood, sweat, and tears, they really had this sense that David Lynch was this creator who had a strong sense of what he wanted and this sort of vision that would carry the whole project through.
I mean this in the kindest way possible. This film should not exist.
It shouldn't have worked out the way it does and to feel as complete as it does. And so even during the process of how he interviewed, he didn't really audition normally. That's not what Lynch was going for. He would just kind of just talk to you and be like, yeah, looks good. Seemed like what we're doing here. He knew what kind of personalities and what sort of physicalities he was looking for. So it wasn't a normal audition process either.
Okay.
Mentioned before that most of this was made in stables. It was in an area of downtown LA where it was shot originally.
Seemed rather unstable, if you ask me.
And that instability bled over into David Lynch's personal life. There was a moment that he recalled where Lynch was sat down by his younger brother and his father.
All right.
And basically they told him, you have to give up on this movie. You have to give up and get a real job because you have a daughter. And that's kind of the tough thing in the background is that this was during a messy divorce. I don't want to say messy. It was during a divorce. But you had a situation where Lynch was living on set and just unwilling to give up this dream because he knew he had a great idea in mind. But in the meantime, he had a family to support in the background, but all of his money and time seemed to be going to this movie instead of to his family.
And Woody Woodpecker plushes. I'm not going to give you context. Look at the Criterion special features sometime. Or it's on YouTube. It was a trailer. That's not context, though. Don't worry. So, after Eraserhead, Lynch has said his family was extremely supportive. Even if they didn't understand his movies or why he even makes them, they've supported him. This is not to portray his family as uninterested or uninvolved. More so that this was a critical moment in time where he was being put to the ultimate test of how dedicated are you really to this project? How much are you willing to give and even risk? Despite all of this, David Lynch reports being a quote-unquote happy camper. In pretty much every photo you see from this time period, he's smiling or goofing off with the crew. Excellent.
He's having a great time. In terms of the shooting process as well, they would shoot at night, which feels really fitting for this film, that it was made at night almost exclusively.
Okay.
And they would stop whenever Alan Splett, the sound man, would hear birds. He would say, birds, birds, and they would stop filming at that time. A quote here from Catherine Coulson, quote, "We actually didn't ever know people would ever see the movie. It was really a labor of love. And it was a labor of one person's vision as an artist coming through on film stock that we all got to help with and be part of. So I think for the most part, it was the process of making the film and being in that moment and staying in that moment meant that we weren't really aware of time passing so much. It may have taken 4 years of shooting, 5 years of post-production, but every moment felt filled up and rich. I wanted to highlight that quote for a few reasons. One, I think it sums up what I've been saying very, very effectively.
Okay.
But also, I think it goes to show Catherine Coulson's dedication to this project, that when we know her as the log lady, we know her as the person that David Lynch picked to basically be his voice when he re-released this on television, to give context to all these different episodes. Catherine Coulson isn't just the log lady, though, right? She isn't just the former wife of Jack Nance.
It's almost as if these are people.
It's almost as if she was a key player in what made Eraserhead.
Yes.
This is David Lynch's vision, don't get me wrong, but Eraserhead wouldn't be Eraserhead if it wasn't for Catherine Coulson, if it wasn't for Alan Splett, if it wasn't for Jack Nance, and etc. down the line.
Yes.
And if it wasn't for an alien baby.
We don't know if it's an alien or a baby.
It is alien to my eyes.
The tests have not been fully in. It's premature.
We open up with a strange sight before even we incorporate alien babies.
Jack Nance.
We see Jack Nance floating through space, the final frontier. And there's these cut back and forths between Henry floating in space with his face and also this person we're going to refer to, as the credits refer to, the man in the planet. And so there's all this sort of environmental stuff happening. There's crackling white noise, whooshing. A lot of whooshing in this film overall.
Just a heavy, heavy schlop of style. Which, by the way, detail I want to bring out. The planet itself is not fully on shot. It's almost as if it's a good, half to maybe a little bit further down of the planet. It's just almost not entirely shown. You'd almost call the shape of it maybe like an Eraserhead. Who knows?
So it leaves a little bit more wiggle room for the interpretation of it being either part of a literal head or the brain, maybe.
Or an eraser.
Or an eraser. On top of this brain eraser thing, there is a shed or barn of some kind. Some sort of structure that has a roof. And the roof has a hole in it. And it's held up by these almost they remind me of tent spokes, but these little strands that are somehow propping this thing up.
Yes.
And inside of that...
Or keeping it from flying.
Inside of that, there's this clanking of machinery, this very dark environment, a cracked window, and the man in the planet.
Yep.
Now, this whole situation is very confusing. David Lynch has said of this experience, quote, "It's very important what goes on there." I still haven't got my David Lynch voice down. You got any tips, Professor?
You just go ahead and call out to Angelo Badalamenti.
Angelo Badalamenti. It's very important what goes on there. There's certain things that happen in the sequence that are key to the rest. And, that's all. Quote, David Lynch.
Yeah, no, seriously, I don't know why it is chanting to Angelo Badalamenti that gets it for you. It
That was better?
Yeah, it was certainly better.
Thank you.
Listeners, if you believe that chanting the name Angelo Badalamenti is going to improve your David Lynch voice, please email us at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com or tweet at us at snakeeyedreams1, the numeral 1, as in 1 Angelo Badalamenti.
So generally, all David Lynch was said in that quote was things happen, and it's really important. He says it's a key to the rest. If we go by the idea of it being a code or a puzzle, this is our key.
This is a famous Blue Rose case.
So, do you feel that way that Lynch says, though? Do you think that this prologue, this opening, is a key to the whole thing?
I don't think all of it is. I do think that there's plenty of it that allows you to start playing off with other ideas later. And in this case, I think the most important moment is the horizontal variant of Henry, as he sort of sits there, stands there, floats there, and something floats out of his mouth.
It's so easy to read into this a little bit more metaphorically than just a literal planet in space, because there's even a moment where Henry's semi-transparent head is over the rock image.
Yes.
So it kind of leads you to believe that it's literally the rock thing is located where his brain is in his head. So it's really easy to read what's going on here as being inside of Henry in some way.
He is both inside and on the outside, floating above his own simple mind.
His mind, his soul, whatever you want to think of this as. It's happening within Henry, perhaps.
Simple sounds like a rude term, but I say simple because we don't know that much about Henry.
And there's also stuff going on here involving a little critter, a little fritter, a little litter, one could say, of I'm going to say, alien tendril thing. You could call it a sperm.
I call it a sperm.
You could call it whatever. You could call it Jackie. You could call it whatever you want.
Sperm.
So this thing emerges out of Henry's mouth.
As I mentioned, yes.
How would you describe the expression of Henry when thing emerges from mouth?
Ah.
I think it's a little surprised, but I'm also reading, like, subjectively, what do I think Henry's feeling when I see it?
Henry's permanent expression is
Confused.
bewilderment, confusion, and surprise.
Now, when the thing comes out of the mouth, the man in the planet stirs. It feels like he's like, that's kind of shifted him on. He's booting up at that point.
Yep, and he is certainly booting things up as he starts playing with a few mechanisms along the way. He has a nice little lever system, you see.
And he's got, like, all these warts, burns, scars on him in some way.
He is a bumpy man.
He's a bumpy man. And as he's pulling this lever, the alien baby whooshes away from Henry, and then he pulls another lever, and we see a crater coming into view. And this crater's got, like, this sort of liquid in it. Now, because the film's in black and white, we see it as a white liquid. Is it truly white? I still think so, yeah. I still think it is, but it appears white nonetheless. And we see this crater.
Yes.
Then the third lever gets pulled, is an intense sound effect, and the alien baby splashes into the liquid crater from above. So
Yes.
the simple read I'm getting here is that this man in the planet is controlling those events. He didn't seem to control the baby appearing. That's what kind of, he like noticed it. And then once the baby appeared, he whooshed it. The crater appeared, and then the third lever, baby comes in. It seems to be like a cause and effect, based on the sequencing.
It's cause and effect, but I think it's more of the mechanism than the man. It's just the man's job, if you will.
Yes.
I would not say that, say for example, it is a man who is pressing buttons to let me into the door. It is simply the mechanism itself, the door opener that opens the door.
But still, again, someone is driving the vehicle. Someone is, making this happen.
Has to follow a range of events based
Yes.
on of whatever intention it is, whether he's paid at the end of the day or if it's a nice little hobby.
And there's even a shot we get from inside of the hole, presumably, like from a perspective shot, because we have darkness all around, and then the hole appears as sort of white from above almost. And there's this loud hissing as we rise out to the white, and that's when it cuts to Henry's perspective. That's the end of that sort of prologue.
Yes.
So this is obviously, breaking this down is going to lead into our overall interpretations of maybe everything.
Yep.
Especially if Lynch says it's a key. So do we want to tackle this right now or save it for later?
Let's go ahead and tackle it inconsistently, but mostly around this point.
Okay.
I feel like I might be wrong, but I feel like we might go on a journey and refer back to this.
This is perfectly okay.
Very well.
So the little creature sperm thing
Critter, fritter, alien baby eater.
that falls in the liquid,
Yep.
it looks conveniently like a certain baby that Jack Nance / Henry will later have.
Yes.
Just maybe biologically, maybe it's just thrust upon him. We don't know. The paternity test is still out on this one. I don't know if does he have his mother's eyes? Who knows?
He has an eye.
He has at least one. And it also looks like the thing that comes up in Henry's mailbox, although a much smaller version.
Yes.
And we also see it with the lady in the radiator, who's
Yes.
squishing those. Now, I'm going to take the interpretative route that these little guys, generally speaking, represent sperm. And more broadly, sexual thoughts.
I think that as far as these items go, might be towards sexual thoughts in general, but I think it's just as a larger whole of Henry's secret. I think that him opening his mouth, the more vocal end to someone's holes, if you will.
Yeah.
It is his overall secret nature or the lack of willingness to speak that births into being this sperm, this being that will eventually become the baby.
Yeah, it's important that it comes from him. He releases this thing
From the mouth.
Not
the nose, not the ears, not the eyes, not the behind, but the mouth.
And that thing, when it drops into the crater with the goo, I think of that as the moment of conception. In a more literal sense, it is the sperm meeting the egg. But I think given this film's sort of nuances, you can interpret this as metaphor for the actual conception of the baby, or more broadly speaking, the idea, the thought, the whatever you want to say that left Henry reaching a sort of point of origin.
I think I've named every single hole that is not the penis. Is belly button a hole?
I don't want to go through orifices with you right now, Professor. I don't want to.
But as it sort of drops in, what about the rest of what's sort of going on? Like, we've got the big one in which, like, this thing is birthed into being. There's going to be a baby in the future. Tell me, Kalil, what do you think of some of the people involved? Like, for example, I would even call maybe the planet, if we consider it as a being, or if we just call it an environment, but also Henry and the Bumpy Man.
I don't think of the planet as a living being. If anything, it reminds me a lot of the idea of like a god in the machine, sort of a deus ex machina, very literally. Yeah. That I almost imagine the man inside, if I read it religiously, it's God. If I read it religiously, it's God. Mm-hmm. Who in this portrayal, if you do think of it as God, it is interesting that it's not actively doing anything on purpose. It's just like you said, following the manual, cranking the things when you need to. It's like God by the numbers.
Okay.
I guess it's time for me to do this. Well, I guess I better make the world turn.
Okay.
So it's a very it's hands-on God, but only by routine. Or I can think of it as, instead of being necessarily God in a religious sense, being an entity inside of the mind, consciousness. But it could also be any of the sort of entities of the mind. If it's not conscious, could be id, could be superego, could be the ego.
Yeah.
Some fraction of his mind churning in that moment. It could be the unconscious reacting to a subliminal thought, or it could be the conscious mind, oh crap, there's a thought here, and then doing something about that, maybe burying that thought into the subconscious.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of fun ways to read in it with none of them being definitive.
Yes.
It could be God. It could be not literally God in the machine, but more so a section of Henry's mind acting as God in Henry's conscious or unconscious thoughts. It could be any of those things. It could be a form of Henry just himself.
Yes.
Because there's even a moment later where Henry sees this man. And when he sees this man, or at least what we're being portrayed as him seeing this man, he kind of recoils a little bit. He's not used to this thing.
Yes.
So its only other appearance outside the planet, though, is when Henry sees it in the radiator, which is already developing layers and layers of what's really going on here. This is probably just Henry staring at his radiator, right?
Yeah.
So it's really dubious whether this man, quote unquote, exists any more than most of the things in this movie exist.
I think that...
With air quotes. I'm doing air quotes, by the way.
Yes. I think that with the texture of the world as well as how much into view it is, this world is something, as you've kind of portrayed so far, as somewhat of a potential mind, if you will.
Well, and it just furthers more, I think, sort of tension within the movie. Maybe I'm reading into it my own self here. There's this tension between the biological and the mechanical.
Yes.
That some things are grotesquely, again, spewing warts, they're bleeding, there's pus, there's sort of a physicality to it that's very disturbing, while also being conflated with machinery, with mechanics, with a sort of industrialization. You noted it during The Grandmother, I think. Were we talking about necessarily mechanical sounds? Weren't we during the birthing of the grandmother?
I believe so, yes.
There was something we talked about that. I think there's more of that here in this movie again.
But probably because there's much more mechanics.
Yeah. So I think that the fact that inside of this sort of rock, we get this man that's very fleshy and gross and physical, but his main function is to mechanically crank these sort of levers. There's, again, that tension brewing in the film itself, narratively, thematically, tonally, between the body and the machine.
I think that...
Which is the title of my next 9 Inch Nails cover project.
I think that with this machine, this inner working sort of property, and the use of this world, I think that the being itself could be kind of like a pre-Twin Peaksian sort of Black Lodge-like figure, someone that is able to somewhat mystically behave and act upon things, but not necessarily out of something like direct malice, though grotesque he and his actions may seem.
Which I think is fun in that interpretative angle, because you can immediately say, oh, it's like a spiritual thing, it's like a god, it's like an entity. But if it is sincerely only within Henry, you could still argue that an unseen force within one's mind that can dictate and control things beyond your conscious awareness, that is like a god in its own sense. That is like a Black Lodge spirit in its own sense. A powerful feeling or thing that controls you. Even, like, for example, I'm going to touch upon this later, too, with some background information, that there's this idea of Henry being stuck in the past. Okay. You could imagine the man in his brain, the man in the rock, the man in the planet, as being the past, controlling his future. That you can imagine the past dictates him, and that this disgusted, warded older figure is simply the machination of the past of Henry's life echoing into his future. That's a perfectly valid reading. Again, none of these dictate what it has to be, but I think they all touch upon the idea that this thing has some sort of control Henry's not fully aware of, and the moments where Henry does see it, it kind of freaks him out.
I think that maybe the past, but also maybe a broken present could even be argued, just because of especially the sound design on like the moving of the levers. It sounds like an old machine that has been left untended, if you will. The overall shed is something that looks absolutely decrepit.
With a giant hole in it.
With a big old hole in it, as well as a very nice scenic looking view.
Could be a hole in his conscience.
Yes. It could be just a hole left behind that is from just general disrepair of something that either cannot be fixed or will not be tended to and will not be fixed for one reason or another. It is a wild scene to just sort of look at and is a heavy mood pusher.
Strong opening. I didn't mention this earlier, but one thing about Eraserhead that's kind of strange is that there's no dialogue for about the first 10 and a half minutes, and there's also no dialogue for the last 20 to 30 minutes. So basically it opens up and ends with a lot of lack of dialogue, a lot of scene building, a lot of action, but not necessarily anyone saying anything, which I think, again, building context non-verbally creates more of that sort of art gallery feeling maybe you're talking about.
Yes. No, I absolutely agree with that. I think that it kind of gives the person a bit of pace whenever they're sort of looking their way through and getting ready in the film. When the dialogue does kick in, it's almost as if it's a contrast in brush strokes, or like use of color, if you will. You have a painting that's entirely black and white, and this is the red that's sort of incorporated in between, because now you have basically razor focus on what they're saying.
Question for you, Professor. So Henry obviously is the main character. Protagonist feels like a strange term to call him, but sure, he's the protagonist.
Sure.
How important do you think Henry is for this story, in the sense of, do you think that this is a character study, basically, that Henry's specifically his personality, his history, his actions, that's what this is about? Or do you take like Henry to be not really that essential? It could be anyone. He's just a stand-in. It's kind of an everyman situation. How important is Henry to Eraserhead?
I think that he is a character that is affected by the overall world. It's just like a small piece to a larger tapestry of what's going on. I don't think that he is overall an everyman, but I think any man could be affected in the same way as Henry. But also a little bit of further insight on, say, for example, the people who exist outside of Henry, dealing with something that is absolutely broken and very industrial. I made a joke during our viewing that this is very much, this is the story told in between Brazil, if you will, just because...
Terry Gilliam's film Brazil, not the country.
Yep, no, this is retelling the history of... No, it is Terry Gilliam. I do believe that this is fully the story and fall of Henry, or rising. It really depends on how you interpret the ending.
Right, it's a happy ending, right?
Sure. But I don't think many people will reach that happy or sad ending. I think that what exists with Henry...
You reach self-actualization, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. I think that there's all sorts of variety that can happen to an individual in this. So, yeah, going back to your question, this leans more onto Henry, but is a possibility for anyone else.
Okay. It's a relatable story. We've all been there.
If we are ever there, it will relate to it. But it doesn't outright say that it is relatable.
Now, just to fine-tune this, when we make these jokes about relatable, what do you think I mean, anyone can relate to things in different ways, but
Yes.
when I say to you, is this movie relatable, what experience do you think you would have to have had to relate to this movie? For yourself, like, what would make you relate to this movie?
A relationship. I'm so
Any relationship.
alone.
Oh, listeners, if you would.
No.
Joking. But seriously, so it just, do you mean like any dating relationship? Does it be marriage? What do you think would be the thing that would make you connect? Because for me, it'd have to have having a kid. I think that the key to relating to this for me, I don't feel like because I've never had a child,
Yes.
I've never gone through that.
Yes.
That's a core piece of this that I can't connect to,
Okay.
that I think is essential for this movie. But it's obviously not the only thing going on here.
I think that it is very dependent on all sorts of relationships. Whenever it comes to, say, for example, trying to relive the past with some characters, when it comes to just dealing with these overall moments with other individuals that does not quite clash or click for a general either end of context or just amount of intensity that can happen in that scene. Or, in Henry's case, it is the question of being stuck, being unable to move, and yet still have to navigate one's either social needs or overall desires or holding them in.
And that's something I think a lot of people can relate to regardless of relationship child status.
Yes.
Is that sort of stuck in a rut sort of vibe? Maybe a bit more existentially, but still kind of that idea. So, Henry.
Yep.
Henry is played by Jack Nance. Now, I don't think I made this a secret. In fact, I think I blatantly told you very early on in the process here.
There was a fish in the percolator.
Exactly. So Jack Nance plays Pete in Twin Peaks. Now, if I hadn't told you that, do you think you would have figured that out?
Yes.
I think Jack Nance is such a singular portrayal as a person, as an actor, that he's very recognizable no matter what decade you're looking at him.
I think that in the decades, I still had a moment like, is that? But as soon as he speaks, I think his vocal performance is something outright unique to Jack Nance.
Now, we've already talked about the Venn diagram between this film and Osmosis Jones.
Yes.
If there's a Venn diagram between Henry Spencer from Eraserhead and Pete Martell from Twin Peaks, what things do they have in common?
They have the same voice. They're played by the same actor. They look intensely. Like, not that their appearance is intense, but their eyes looking at something can be very intense.
Relationship problems? It's complicated for both of them.
It's certainly complicated. They both are submerged in liquid likely in one point in their lives.
What? Aren't we all?
But in this case, it's the metaphorical bed liquid, as well as I imagine Pete has been in water for fishing.
I think there's suffice to say, I think we've made it clear that they're very different characters.
Yes.
That I think Jack Nance has portrayed, from your experiences of seeing him in two very different roles.
Yes.
For this actor. I can't even ask you which one you prefer, because Twin Peaks, you have episodes and episodes and episodes of bias. It's going to be hard for you to not think of him as Pete.
Maybe I just like him as Jack Nance, Kalil. Have you ever asked whether or not I just like him in his role of himself?
Do you like Jack Nance in his role of himself?
I don't know him really, so I think I'm going to go with Pete.
Okay. When you were watching it, did you think of, was it hard for you to get Pete out of your mind, or was it pretty easy for you to think, this is not Pete?
I know that's not Pete. It's just Pete will always be the first name that comes to mind because of how many times I heard him and the word Pete being associated with one another. That's the fun part of getting to see actors so often.
Yes, because I am in that situation where I really don't think of him as Pete because I think that's Jack Nance.
Yes.
Because Jack Nance is such a recurring element in Lynch's films.
Okay.
I've never seen Jack Nance outside of David Lynch. I don't even know, filmography-wise, what else he's been involved in. He's just been in almost every David Lynch film, so that's what I think of him first and foremost.
This is why you have to do all the research, Kalil. You need to know all the tabs and all the people.
When you see behind the scenes or interviews with David Lynch, do you think that's Gordon Cole? I was kind of curious about that one too.
I think that I would have if it wasn't for the fact that you pointed out David Lynch as a person.
I gave him identity at one point or another.
Yeah, no, when you give him an identity, give him a sense of association, especially in such a large role.
Sure.
Yeah, no, it immediately becomes that way. I have that issue whenever I don't know someone is a director prior to the point, and then it's slowly kind of molds into one thought, and it becomes distracting otherwise if I know it going in.
Okay, interesting. So David Lynch said of Jack Nance that Jack Nance is one of his best friends, that they worked together on about 6 movies over the course of 25 years, and obviously Twin Peaks included in that.
Yeah.
Quote, Jack was the unsung hero of actors. I'll miss his dry, absurdist wit, his stories, and his friendship. I'll miss all the characters he would have played.
Yes, because at this time, Jack Nance has passed away.
Yes, and I think it was around like 1997, around that area. Very strange story about his death and kind of the mystery behind it, which I'll leave the listener to look into if they haven't already before.
With donuts.
I think it was donuts. Don't quote me on that.
Don't quote him on
Don't
that.
quote me on
Don't quote
that.
me on that either, but donuts.
So I really find that line to be rather poignant and tragic. I'll miss all the characters he would have played, because even when in supplementary material, Jack Nance wasn't in The Elephant Man, but as soon as it was brought up that if Jack Nance had been around when that film was made, because I think it was being shot in Europe or something, if Jack Nance would have been available, he would have been in the film. Like, not even a single doubt or question. David Lynch is like, yep, he would have been there. Like, Jack Nance would go in every film that David Lynch made the moment he's available to be there, which I just thought it was really interesting. I think it goes beyond simply loyalty, but like they were clearly connected thoughts and connected brainwaves.
Yes.
Lynch then referring more specifically to the character of Henry, quote, he watches things very, very carefully because he's trying to figure them out. He might study the corner of that pie container just because it's in his line of sight. And he might wonder why he sat where he did to have that be there like that. Everything is new. It might not be frightening to him, but it could be a key to something. Everything should be looked at. There could be clues in it. So basically, Henry is your average Twin Peaks fan.
Yep, Henry
Right?
is a Sam Stanley.
Looking at the containers of every pie tin just to make sure there's no details in it.
Yes.
And no, I think the Sam Stanley comparison's there. This is Sam Stanley if he was even more inclusive, introverted, withdrawn into himself and his own inner world.
Yeah, just imagine if Sam Stanley hardly spoke.
Yeah, and I think there's a similarity to that. What do you think of then Henry as a protagonist, main character, being someone who doesn't really speak and just looks at everything super confused? How does that contribute to Eraserhead?
It emphasizes further his flaws. It makes it more confusing on how everything ends for him. And I can't even say whether or not he even had a full journey for himself. I think that he made certain choices and certain actions that were very selfish almost.
I think it adds a bit of humor too, in the sense that we get to see his funny reactions. He's got a funny way of expressing his facial expressions.
Yes.
But then also I think seeing him react to relatively normal things with confusion, but then reacting to things that are even weirder, either with the same amount of expression or less confusion. Like, he's just as confused about his wife calling to go eat dinner at her parents' place as he is going inside of a radiator and seeing a woman crushing sperms. Like, those are both equal experiences to him.
Yes.
Everything is confusing relatively equally.
Yes.
If he goes to the grocery store and he's picking which milk to buy, I imagine Henry looking at the selection of whole milk, 2%, 1%, skim, almond milk, soy milk, looking at all of this with the level of confusion and perplexity the same way he does when he's looking at his alien child. It's about the same, which I think contributes to, again, that level of humor that, yeah, we relate to Henry in that he's looking at confusing things, but it's just so equally confusing for everything to him that it adds an element of humor, I feel.
How does Henry eat on his own?
I don't know how Henry does anything on his own.
Like,
he goes on the toilet, and I'm sure he's looking at the toilet paper, feeling the material, just looking at it perplexed.
There's like a bathroom. There's like another room that's just a combination between his bedroom and any other need. I didn't see a fridge or anything like that. Yeah.
I'd say aside from confusion, the most notable other emotion I would maybe give Henry would be a sort of wistfulness that when he's looking at the radiator, when he's kind of staring into that radiator, there's almost like a little glimmer of, like, I wouldn't say hope, but there's this look on his face of a dreaminess, a quality of daydreaming that happens with him that goes beyond just simply his nervous curiosity. There's moments where he kind of lets go of looking at his surroundings and just like phases out of reality. Those situations feel pretty important to Henry. And then also he's got some lust. He's got some grade A American lust.
I think that the lust can be a certain angle of, I don't know fully if it is entirely sexual. I mean, sex does happen we do see. Sperm does happen. But I think that Henry overall just wants escape. He wants out of his situation.
He wants Ape Escape, the PlayStation 1 video game.
Yes, amazing soundtrack.
Soundtrack.
Just like this film.
Just like there's a Venn diagram between Ape Escape and Eraserhead, and I'd put that there. He also seems a bit defensive when he's asked later, or not really asked, when told later that he's late for dinner, and he immediately is like, I didn't know I was supposed to be here. I didn't know this was going on. So there's a bit of defensiveness naturally. He has a little bit of fight in him with his wife especially. We think they're married.
Wife at the moment.
Are they married by the time later in the movie? It's kind of not really stated if they got married in the 2 days that this movie takes place.
Yeah. It's
what feels like 2 days, but it could also be 100 days.
If we are to believe the continuity happened with the mother later, they would have to be married at that point because they would get married then pick up the baby.
I think it's confusing because the way it was worded is you need to get married and then take care of the baby. So like the sequential order would be marriage first.
Yes.
But then also when they have the baby, there's that moment, I'll just kind of say it now, where, Mary leaves and it sounds like she's going to be gone for one night. Henry's like, well, will you be back tomorrow? And she's like, well, I just need a good night's sleep. And then she later just kind of pops back in the bed. And a lot of time seems to take place in between those two.
That's not Mary.
Mary's in the bed.
Mary is in the bed as the actress as well as what is personified. But as far as I'm concerned, that is either basically a dream or a parallel to the baby because...
So that's the question. Does Mary ever come back? How many days is Mary gone? How much is there versus a dream? When Henry's talking to the woman across the apartment, or like across the hallway, when she asks where his wife is, he's like, I don't know. She must have gone back to her parents again.
Yep.
Well, how many times has she gone to her parents? How many days is this? What's going on?
It's blur.
It's very blurred. So it makes it really clear, like, are they even married? How much time has transpired? Because they've either had, like, maybe 2 days in this whole movie, or maybe it's been a long time. The only constant we can guarantee is that the baby was still a baby at the moment of death.
Well, as far as the update goes, we do know that the neighbor updates Henry, about the overall dinner, and when Henry does arrive, I think the biggest offense that he gives forward is that she doesn't come around anymore. So it's almost as if he's even like pressing the fact that he almost wants to be less active with this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's pretty much an immediate aversion to even talking about this because when he's talking to Mary's mom, he won't say if they've had sex. When it's brought up like, hey, you have a baby, he's like completely shuffled into a corner with his nose bleeding.
Yep.
It's causing him so much internal stress, but he just cannot get words out.
Yes.
Even when Mary's mom is pressed against him, like making out with his neck, instead of like pushing the mom away in any single degree, he just calls for Mary to do something. He's just stuck against the wall.
It's very much Henry is, if not just secrets, we could just say a lack of action to even...
I think he's non-committal.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a moment where, Mary asks, do you mind getting married? And he's like, oh, no, I don't mind. Like, he says it like, do you want tacos for dinner?
He's living a very passive life.
And going back to the idea of secrets, the mailbox, like, he deliberately lies to Mary when she asked, did you get anything in the mail? And he actually had gotten this little box with the sperm alien creature inside, and he put that away into a cupboard and then lied to her, no, I didn't get any mail. So we know that he can be secretive directly in that one scene for sure.
Yes.
If not more secrets and more lies surrounding it.
Yes. Which we'll get back to that a bit more because that is a very, very fun scene. I think it really does open up avenues.
But above all else, Henry is a normal person like you and I, right? Henry has a job. He works for that bread on that table.
Yeah, what was the name of the company again?
I don't know. Did it ever say?
Yes.
What is it called?
I didn't write it down either. He works for a company.
Oh, I got it written down. I found it. So he works at Lapel's factory.
Yep, Lapel's factory. He does printing.
He is printing.
Yep.
He's on vacation, though.
If you ever look at the outside world, though, printing doesn't seem like to be the biggest concern, if you will.
This is where my ignorance shows through. In 1977, and someone said they're a printer, I don't know what that fully means.
They print paper.
They do, but like, what does he do? Does he pull levers like the man in the planet? Like,
it is somewhere between that old age when print became first a thing in which there were levers being pulled and print was literally being stamped on, or when there was technology in which there would be a machine to do that, but you just monitor it to make sure it's up to customer snuff. It's somewhere between those long ages.
I'm assuming we're the latter. I don't know the complete level of technology in this time period, though. Well, the professor's doing some Googling. See, we always have these transitions from our research, but we don't ever do it beforehand, so I thought I'd do this one this time.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it has to be somewhere between like 1440 and 90. Look, today, 2021,
or whenever you're listening to this.
Yes, because that's when the printing press was invented, or at the very least, my quick googling tells me. So, could have had levers, may have not had levers.
Hello, listeners of the year 2060. How's the planet?
Also, listeners, don't email us about it. I don't personally want to know. I don't look out the window anymore. We're in a condensed space forever now.
So, speaking of people in a condensed space forever, Henry. So, he works at this printer factory. Not really that clear of...
on vacation from the
on vacation. Let's just say he's not a career man in the sense of he has a passion he's working behind.
No, it's just something that's probably he's getting away from at the moment, and even, again, adds kind of less significance for what he's doing.
And if we're looking at it kind of metaphorically, if his role is just to pull a few levers and handle a semi-automated process...
or push buttons.
It's a passive job. It's something that you don't have to really come up with new ideas for or really work hard at. It's something you just kind of do that's a routine, which, again, feels in line with Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Because time is so weird, it's also unclear sometimes what his mannerisms are. There was a moment where I thought for sure he was sleeping in his suit and tie in bed, but that's just because of the way things cut. So, like, there'll be a time where he's in a suit, then suddenly he's in bed without showing him taking off the suit, and he's in a button-up. It's not like pajamas. He's got a shoe on still in bed, his shoes. Then it'll cut again, and he'll be in bed with what look like pajamas. So, like, he presumably takes off his clothes to go to bed.
Presumably.
But there was a moment where he was in bed with shoes on and a tie, and I'm just like, do you sleep like that?
He does whatever he wants. Do you want to see the dressing scenes? Do you want to see the Jack Dance body?
Yes.
Well, that's good. By all means, enjoy.
So the real question is, does his wife, or soon-to-be wife, Mary, want to see the dress-up scenes?
I don't know.
How into Henry is Mary? That's a really good question, right?
Well, Henry says that he loves her. I can't recall a scene where she says it back.
She does propose they should get married.
I think that it was
Out
more
of
so
fear?
her mother
Trembling voice.
Her mother was proposing that they get married, and then she just kind of like goes along with it. I think that the scene with the worm emphasizes further not only of Henry's position, but also Mary's position, because Mary is someone that seems very uncomfortable through most of the scenes, but especially, since we're going straight into intimacy, not really wanting to physically be with
A little frigid.
Henry after their first encounter of the sexual nature.
Depending on what was dreamed and what was real is also questionable too in this.
Yes, I think that's the scene with the small little sperm worm being placed in the cabinet is important. Sperm, because she's awake through him putting it in the cabinet. And when after he's put it in the cabinet and he reaches out to her, she twitches and moves away. I believe that she's fully aware of Henry's more secretive nature, or even the secrets themselves. And so having those intimate moments amongst the stress of having to deal with what is basically a product of his secrets, if my view of this baby is to be believed, it has made her beyond uncomfortable, to the point that she, when stuck in this situation, can't really handle it and has to find that point of escape, and is able to take the action to get away, at least for a night, because this is all too much. And that's also saying something, because in a scene that we get introduced, say when Mary is welcoming Henry in after their mild means conflict, right? Yes, there's a point in which, during the dialogue and asking more about Henry and interviewing him, her hair is brushed after she begins sort of having a reaction.
She doesn't brush her own hair. Her mother brushes her hair.
Exactly.
She doesn't even brush her own.
And that sort of quells the reaction. I think that this is a quick item in order to show she is someone quite anxious. She is someone that is possibly very much affected by her emotions, that it's only thanks to that sense of familiarity from something like her mother, this comforting motion, that she's able to be calmed back. Everything else that happens, especially with Henry, is either unfamiliar territory or something that is very stressful to deal with, likely because of Henry.
Well, you can notice, based on even that encounter, she sits on the couch very close to her mother, with Henry almost on the exact opposite end.
Yes, and whether that is more so on Henry's end or her end or both ends, they're also just end to end.
And at this moment, Henry's posture is a lot more like relaxed, kind of slunken into the chair. She would know that there's this baby, or might be a baby. She's not sure what it is.
We don't know.
She knows that in the background. So I kind of interpret a lot of her anxieties here being the information she and her mom know that Henry doesn't know.
Yes.
It is curious, though, that the moment where she appears to have symptoms, I don't want to say a panic attack, but that clear incident of anxiety, that seems to occur when her mom is asking Henry what he does for work.
Yeah.
And what he did do for work. That's when Mary's eyes start rolling back. She starts scratching her knees, the gagging, the whimpering noises.
Yeah, no one has really a positive reaction whenever his work is brought up.
So it feels like there's some anxiety here about, this is again where subjectivity enters. What do you read this as? It could possibly be her concern about Henry's ability to support the child and the family. Like, if she marries this guy, if she has a kid with this guy, how stable is this going to be? Mm-hmm. And I feel like that could maybe be part of the background, or maybe it's just that she's struggling knowing about this child and it's not being talked about. It's kind of eating away at her, that this sort of secret that she can't handle. I think there's several ways to read into the situation, but the fact that in this moment she's not next to Henry, she's on the opposite side next to her mother, reveals a lot about those sort of background securities.
Okay.
Some lighter notes here from background here. So the actor who plays this character, plays Mary, his name's Charlotte Stewart. And I know that you saw her obviously in Eraserhead, and you saw her in some of the interviews and little times we talked about special features.
Yep. I know what you're getting to, Kalil.
So I told you, the hour of reckoning's upon you.
Yep.
Now I told you, don't look it up.
Yep.
But can you say who you think Charlotte Stewart played on Twin Peaks?
I can't, because I feel like I'd be messing things up. Like, this person seems really talented, and I don't want it to make it seem like it's fusing with someone else's talent.
So the short answer is you did not recognize her.
I did not recognize her, no.
So, in your defense, this is not a very major player in Twin Peaks. However, it is someone that we have seen not only in Twin Peaks Seasons 1 and 2, as well as in The Missing Pieces. This is Charlotte Stewart plays Betty Briggs, Bobby's mom, Major Briggs' wife.
Oh.
She is the reader of Revelation when she's knitting with her husband. So, again, more of a subdued background character.
Yes.
But she does play the wife of Garland Briggs in Twin Peaks.
Very well. Okay.
I don't know if there's any interesting connections you have in this moment, what your thoughts are, now that you've kind of put one and one together that they're the same person.
I know of Betty Briggs' occurrences in the series. I know that I remember her acting, but only when I remember Betty Briggs is a character, because Bobby as well as Garland are much more bigger involvers inside the story.
I think the parallel you could draw here between Mary and Betty then being that they're both quieter women in the household, in the position of wife and mother, who fall to that sort of background position to everyone else in their life. Now, Betty, from the instances we've seen of her so far in Twin Peaks, seems to have her act together much more solidly than Mary does, by all stretch of the imagination. She seems to be putting herself further together. And when we have that moment where we see Garland Briggs being gone for a few days, she has that sort of resolute confidence to keep calm and keep things going, even when you know she's worried sick.
Yes.
And she seems to support her husband's strategies toward fatherhood and his way of life. She seems to be a really big partner.
Yes.
And this might seem like a strange thing to kind of say, again, going back to Twin Peaks, we never really mentioned this. In terms of the marriages of Twin Peaks, we talked about how most relationships aren't very stable. From what we gather, I would almost argue that Betty Briggs and Garland Briggs is one of the most solid relationships we see in Twin Peaks. You could argue it's by virtue of not seeing it very often, but every scene we've seen them together, they're just kind of chilling around each other's company.
Yeah.
They kind of complement each other's sort of demeanors. They're mostly relaxed unless they're yelling at Bobby, but considering what Bobby's up to, murdering people for drugs in the woods.
1 to 2 people.
I kind of understand their approach a little bit better, even if it's not always the right way to go about it, so to speak.
Okay.
But yeah, it seems like Betty is kind of with Garland Briggs pretty securely, which, considering that her prior role was Mary, it's a better marriage.
Yeah, but
it's a
as
better
far as
relationship.
Mary X goes, it's like that, but also on steroids because they're the best together, right?
What do you think of X, by the way? So it's Mary X in the credits, and then we see that Mary's parents are known as Mr. X and Mrs. X.
Fill in the roles.
So why does Henry have a last name?
Henry has a last name because he is a focus character,
Okay.
if you will.
Because everyone else is either like the boy, the bum, the man in the planet.
Paul!
The lady in the radiator. There's also Paul, yes. Whatever you want to do with that.
I mean, send him back to the counter, mostly.
That's most likely. I don't know. X marks the spot. I don't know.
Again, I think that it is something to fill in the dot on. It is the X that is preceded with the signature. These people are only as important to Henry as the story needs it to be. It still is, again, that inside of the outside world. They are still very unique in their ways, but I think that the naming convention is more so necessary only for Henry's perspective more than anything. Yeah, I think that I'm going to stick with that. It is something from Henry's perspective. The last name need not matter because they are simply Mary and the parents.
So I don't have as much to say about the background information for Mr. and Mrs. X
Yeah.
because they're not necessarily actors that Lynch has worked a lot with. But David Lynch did say when talking about Eraserhead that the mom's actor, Jean Bates, that he felt at the time she was too beautiful for the role. Too beautiful of a woman for the role.
You're too beautiful.
But the actor had what he called a fixation on the part.
Okay.
So after kind of compromising, David Lynch ended up kind of modifying her face expression for the role, where he gave her a wart, kind of a lazier eye, and then he said he added facial hair. Now, I didn't catch the facial hair when watching it. Even when
wasn't
looking
restored
for it.
enough.
Yeah, even when looking for the facial hair, I don't see it. But supposedly all those things were done to her face to kind of increase that element. And then she pulled through with the rest of it to make the character not necessarily as quote-unquote beautiful. I think it's more the mannerisms of what she spends her time doing in the film make her seem a little gross.
Okay.
I don't know. I thought that was just interesting background that he almost didn't cast her for beauty reasons.
Yeah.
In terms of the background trivia, there's also this element where Mary's parents live in a house. We see the house number where it says number 2416. Curiously enough, if you want to read into this, David Lynch and his wife at one point had lived in Philadelphia on 2416 Poplar Street.
Okay.
So he used the house number that he had previously lived at. Make
okay.
of that what you will.
Will do. After all, it's just a mother and a father and a daughter inside of a nice little home. Nothing to parallel here.
No.
Not at
However,
all.
speaking of parallels, there's a lot of flower parallels happening in this film.
Flower power.
In general, a lot of plants. Plants are a big deal.
Plants in quotation mark. I know
Yes.
that they are plants.
Plants with an exclamation mark.
Plants with an asterisk.
So
Exclamation mark, question mark, stars.
we see flower patterns not very subtly in this area because inside of the X household, there's flower patterns on the curtains, on the chairs, on the dining room wall. There's various flower decorations, and even like the mat that the lamp is sitting on looks like a flower.
Are we going to talk about the bookshelf that has
Dirt.
dirt, like grass? It's the viney plant.
There's even like these sort of viney plant-like things attached to the wall, like maybe plant stems on the wall.
Yeah.
In addition to white splotches of paint.
Not a
White dots coming back again.
Not a common thing on the outside world from what we've seen, but on the inside world, the big fans.
Again, curiosity of a world in which it's all concrete and pipe on the outside. But again, don't worry, that pipe doesn't lay itself. And mix then with the inside having so much earth, having so much soil, having so many plants. Curious. I feel like there's something there you could talk about.
Oh, and no potted plants either. Like, as far as I could tell, there's only an singular instance where we see plants in pots. Henry's home is not that point. It's just that it's like a pile of dirt in a plant. Kind of looks like a scene from The Grandmother, but yeah.
There is no pots in Henry's house.
No pot.
No pot. Also, we get, curiously, a mother dog with a lot of puppies, sucklings.
Poppily suckling, yes.
Over and really loud squealing noises. One of the really good Alan Splett sound design choices of that sort of rubbery squealing now.
Real great sound design, but real great sound design is never the same thing
Your
as...
cat Stella was pretty into it.
Yep, she was very much into it. It's never going to be something that's going to be 100% comfortable sound design. It is very uncomfortable.
I mean, I'm just reading into the obvious thing here of the motherhood, the dogs, sort of having that parallel of the very innate biological needs of having a child and needing to support that child through all of the different methods that one can. Professor, what do you interpret the dog and the puppies as?
I interpret them as the overall mood setter for...
How many times do you think we're going to get to make weird noises into microphones for this podcast and like thoroughly gross out people listening with headphones?
I think it's a good mood setter.
It's certainly a mood setter.
Because we are very uncomfortable listening to it, and these people are probably very uncomfortable being around one another. It sets the tone for some of the characters who find this to be quite normal, such as just the mother still stone-focused, as we have Henry sort of looking about the room on all sorts of distractions. I find it to be, as you were mentioning before, that little parenting parallel. I think that there are so many layers into this, I'd almost call it cake.
Dog cake.
Oh, no.
I'm just thinking of like a birthday cake that's like shaped like a dog.
Sure.
Like Duff, the cake boss man. Mm-hmm. Are Duff and the cake boss man the same person?
I have no idea who Duff and Cake Boss are.
I think they're two different people.
They could be. I've never met them.
Anyway, there's also a clock on the wall. It's a cuckoo bird clock, and there's only one hand on the clock, and it's pointing at the number 8. So...
Yes.
8 p.m. dinner? We're just going to assume that that's what's happening?
Or it's 40 minutes into dinner.
One of the two. I don't think it takes place 40 minutes into the movie, so we can't go that meta. In terms of the parents themselves, we described the household. When Henry meets the mom, immediately after he says, "Oh, it's very nice to meet you," she like commands him to sit down. She's got a sense of strong presence from the moment he enters. She is here to conduct the business of her daughter's child and marriage, and she's going to communicate this, and Henry's just going to have to listen.
Yep.
She also doesn't seem to know much about Henry at all.
Nope.
Because when she meets him, she's like, "It's Henry, isn't it?"
Well,
which gives the idea that maybe Mary hasn't been dating Henry very long, or that we don't necessarily see Mary talking about Henry very much.
Or she's playing dumb.
We definitely see the sense, though, that Henry has never met the mom before. So regardless of the situation, there's an oncoming baby, and the parents have never met the guy before.
Again, or he's just curious at everything and reacts the same way to everything. I say this because of a later setup.
When she is having dinner at the table, there's these tiny little chickens, right? So we don't know who bought them. We just know that the dad is very enthusiastic about them, that they're man-made chickens and they're new.
Yep.
And these man-made chickens that are new, when Henry's poking them with the fork, their legs start moving and they start spewing liquid ooze out of the orifice. Now, this might be a gravy of some kind, but it definitely has a very profound effect on Mrs. X. Could you please describe, in words, not sounds, please, the effect of Mrs. X on seeing the and hearing the tiny chicken?
Orgasm.
So I detect a sort of sexual undertone that you're picking at here. Want to say anything else about that?
As much as I could try to describe a chicken orgasm paralleling with the woman orgasm.
Well, between What Did Jack Do in this, there's some sort of sexual frustration involving chickens with David Lynch. We got to look at
those breasts, man.
I'm going to defend the not... whoa, I almost hit the mic there. I'm getting so passionate.
You are aggressively defending.
I'm going to defend this here a little bit and say an alternative where it could be that she is having that reaction because she's hungry and the chicken smells, sounds, looks so good. So like the eyes rolling in the back of the head, the panting, it could be sexual, but it also could be like, give me some of that spices, give me some of that chicken.
I refuse that because what happens after is Mary begins to freak out.
Now, here's where I'm coming from with this.
Go for it.
Hear me out.
No.
I think that there's layering happening here where she's hungry, she wants the chicken, she's drooling at how good this chicken is, but the way in which the legs are moving and the stuff is coming out of that orifice on the chicken, I think of it as birth. So this is where it could be the idea that subliminally, whatever you want to make it, in the mother's mind, but especially in Mary's mind, it's reminding them of the thing that they know that Henry doesn't know. Mary has to leave the room, and so does the mom, because they got to go talk about the baby. Because that is what they talk about, presumably, when they leave the room to go into the kitchen.
Well, then why doesn't stuff like stuffing come out of it? There's usually, like, you know, a baby
I think
that pops
we're
out.
looking at the things that might preclude the baby, or the epilogue to the baby, the other fixins, if you will.
Right, but baby.
I don't know. I think you can definitely read this as like a sexual thing. I read it as sexual only in the sense of it is reminding them of the birthing process, which obviously follows sex and would involve the sexual organs of, you know, woman. So, or, you know, saying here.
You're definitely saying stuff inside of here. But I find this scene, especially the scene that sort of follows after, in which Henry is cornered, pushed against a wall, and being told, like, you know, tell me. No. Tell me. Oh, aren't you a bad boy? Kissy. I could almost read whether, if we believe that the timeline is true inside of this, perhaps maybe they did know each other or meet each other in a previous time. If time is inconsistent with this meeting, if you will, then perhaps something happened during the encounters with the parents, that maybe something happened between Henry and the mother.
I don't agree with this one. I get where you're coming from. I don't think that Henry had any involvement with the mother prior to this meeting. I do think they genuinely have never met each other before. And I don't think that there was thus an affair. I don't think they knew each other before. I think when Henry says it's nice to meet you and she's not sure what the name is, I think that's genuine.
I think that instances that do happen with, say, for example, two future characters, that there's a bit of intimacy between Henry and them. Mm-hmm. I do believe it is a bit possible, if only for the go with the flow nature that he's been with. If it wasn't for, say, for example, Mary to pull him away in the instance, what would happen thereafter? He is someone that has no control over his life, and with such a strong personality that could tell him an order and put him to a point that may have such desires.
I think it's really interesting in kind of telling Mary's response to this, because when he calls out for Mary, she pulls the mother away and she's just like, Mom! Like, she's obviously not okay with this, but she's not even like that surprised. I feel like this is a thing that sometimes her mom just does. Like, has Mary brought over boyfriends in the past and the mom just like seduces them in the hallway? And by seduces, I mean throws herself on them aggressively out of nowhere. It's a curiosity.
It is something.
Is because Mary didn't seem that surprised about it. I don't think that Lynch in general is just throwing weird crap at us just to throw weird crap, but this is one of the moments where I feel like it gets the closest to that.
Yeah. Because
it's so strange the way the mother's acting and how little Mary and Henry seem to really respond to this. They never call it out for what this is. So, but they both acknowledge that definitely the mother was doing this and Mary should pull her away, but the rest of the conversation just follows as though it hadn't happened. So I don't know how much we're supposed to focus on that moment. They don't focus on that moment.
Yes.
It's a strange situation. I'm more interested in Bill. Mr.
Oh, I'm
X.
sorry, Mr. X, yes. He says his name is Bill.
He has a name tag on his uniform.
It says Bill, he says his name is Bill, but I still lean on the fact that it doesn't say Bill X, that his name just doesn't matter.
So he is a plumber. And when he's talking in the doorway, kind of his introduction scene, becomes like super passionate and worked up about how the city has changed. It used to have pastures, and now it's become what he calls a hellhole. And, you know, he put in every pipe in this neighborhood, and pipes don't grow on their own. Look at my knees! Look at my knees!
Did you look at his knees?
I looked at his knees.
Well, how would you rate his knees?
I'd give him a good 7 out of 10.
7 out of 10 knees?
It needs some work.
I think that his knees would get a firm 4 out of 10 because we're going to the below average state. Because I don't think that he's worked on every single pipe in the city.
He might
and
have.
His knees has
How
been
do you know he
proved.
hasn't? Cite your sources. How do you know he hasn't?
It's a preceding statement. I believe that he has.
Oh.
But I don't believe he has worked on every pipe in the city, and he has immaculate knees. I don't think they improve as you go on through more and more
I
pipes.
think it's more the idea that his knees have become weathered down and worn down by all the pipe laying.
Yeah, not 7 out of 10 knees. unless you just have like
I
very
judge
low
my
standard
knees based on
knees.
battle scars. No, I think it's interesting. He goes on this giant rant. Not even giant. It's not giant in length. It's a really short rant.
It's just
but the amount of audio intensity, like the dog starts barking. There's all this like concentrated, pressurized noise happening.
It's as I said before. This is after he hears what Henry's job is, and sure, it might be just a casual response. But I do believe that since we're paralleling points, he mentions he's a printer, and the way people react when they hear he's a printer, I think that not only is there a defensiveness, but also a sharing of, oh yeah? Oh, well, you're doing that. Guess who has to deal with this freaking stuff?
I can bend cables.
No, I don't think it's a pride thing. I think it's a pain thing.
That's fair.
I think that he continually puts a smile on. I don't think he's entirely in his own head, but he is someone who is very affected by what's going on.
So there's an incident he talks about at the dinner table before they eat that 14 years ago, Bill had an operation on his left arm, and the doctors said that he wouldn't be able to use it, would be useless for the rest of his life. But Bill did not believe that. So
yeah, he doesn't listen to
every
people.
half hour,
not his family, not his doctors, no one.
Every half hour he would rub it. He'd rub that arm.
Yes.
And over time he got the feeling in his arm back. Kind of. Got to use it at least.
No, he got to use it.
He got
no
to use
feeling.
it because he says now he can't feel a thing in it. It's all numb.
Exactly.
And there's this line he says after that. It's when the chickens are on the table. And I feel like there's like layers of here you can interpret it. He says, I'm afraid to cut it, you know? So the way he's talking about it, he's like making motions over his arm. So the first way I thought of it, I think the first way a lot of people would think of it is we don't think he's talking about the chickens because he hasn't brought them up yet. We think he's talking about his arm. He's afraid to cut his arm.
Yep, he hasn't seen the face of God yet.
We find then, no, he means cut the chickens. He's afraid to cut the chickens. And he says how usually, I think he says Mary's the one to usually cut the chickens.
Okay.
But he's going to offer Henry the opportunity this time.
Oh, isn't that sweet?
Isn't that sweet? And when the women are out in the kitchen talking about the incoming baby and Henry's none the wiser, Bill and Henry engage in some small talk, in which Bill asks very, politely, what do you know? By politely, I mean intensely, glaring.
Yes, what
smiling.
do you know?
And Henry's just like, I don't know much of anything. And then an elongated period of time occurs in which they do not say anything to each other at all.
Bill's very focused on smiling at Henry.
And it's that intensity that I find, again, very humorous. But if we want to take his character more seriously, there is some pain and awkwardness happening when he tries to relate to this person, a lot of which is just this competitive, not even competitive, but like, show me your scars and let me prove mine are worse sort of deal. I don't know. And then, I mean, I don't mean to leave out the third member of the family that isn't Mary in this household.
The dog.
The grandmother.
Oh.
Not the David Lynch short film, but the grandmother.
Yep.
So she's sitting in the kitchen.
Yep.
How would you describe her?
Sitting in the kitchen.
Uh-huh. So she's non-responsive.
She's sitting in the kitchen.
She is kind of idly looking. I don't know if she's looking at anything.
She's blinking for a time until she doesn't blink anymore.
The most notable thing about her, two things, is that, one, she clearly needs her cigarettes, and we know she's alive based on the fact she does puff them. She does smoke with the idea of a living person.
On the first scene we see her, yes.
The second scene, we don't know for sure if she's still kicking.
Yes.
And then in the middle of these two scenes, we have a moment where Mrs. X puts a salad bowl in the grandmother's lap and then uses, kind of almost like puppeteering, uses the grandmother's arms and hands to toss the salad.
Just like how Grandma used to make.
So there's this idea, right? Someone trapped in the past, someone trapped in their routines almost, that because this is how grandmother used to do it, they're kind of following that in. I don't know if it's inherently a negative or a positive thing. Just kind of this strange situation where clearly the one doing this is Mrs. X, but she still has it treated as though the grandmother's doing the action.
Yes, it's almost as if maybe it's some form of physical activity they're adding to Grandma's life in case like she is unable to move for herself, or if it is something to parallel that and of having Grandma make it and that comfort that comes from it, and also using probably what Grandma usually wants or does around that time and give her a cigarette.
Mm-hmm.
It's all something that it plays a role of replaying instances. Like, I can imagine this is not the first time that she's walked up behind Grandma and had things
Oh, for
move
sure.
around.
No, it seems like a regular occurrence.
Yes, it seems that this is just, as mentioned before, routine.
So anything else you think is interesting or notable about the household of the parents or the family themselves outside of Mary?
I think the fact that they are just in this moment and never seen from again continues to add credence on why Mr. and Mrs. X. But it's also important because that's all that we end up last seeing of anything of the outside world from Henry's perspective, unless you think he's fully conscious in another scene. We are very closed off inside of the overall apartment. This short bit of fresh air happens so earlier in the film, and then we don't really get much of that much later. It makes the apartment feel all the smaller thanks to it.
Yeah. And to happen relatively early in the film to have this part.
Yes.
If they would have moved this scene later, it would be a weird reprieve, whereas now we're kind of left in the apartment the rest of the movie.
Yes, with the exception of a mild tangent.
Which maybe makes more sense for why Henry's escapist mind is daydreaming to those places.
Yes, unless you believe it's canon.
And speaking of cannons, it's like David Lynch decided to hit us with a cannon, and by the cannonball, he used a alien baby fetus.
He used baby. The trials have not come back yet. The paperwork still needs to be done. Multiple experts must be checked in with because that's not a baby. And if it is a baby, that's the baby of Jar Jar Binks.
I do not want to believe that Jar Jar Binks has reproduced. I'd like to live in a world in which Jar Jar Binks has not reproduced.
Well, that's quite rude. I think that Jar Jar Binks has the right to partake upon his loins.
He has the right to. That doesn't mean I want him to. I can live in a world in which he hasn't.
What has Jar Jar Binks done wrong?
I mean, arguably led to the rise of the greatest dictator in the entire universe of the Star Wars galaxy.
Well, yes, but other than that...
Nothing.
Exactly.
Nothing wrong.
Nothing.
Aside from that.
Aside
a pivotal role in the rise of Emperor Palpatine.
Other than
Spoilers
that.
for Star Wars? In case you didn't know that Chancellor Palpatine becomes the Emperor.
Yes.
You might not have known.
You might not have known.
So, you also might not have known that many people believe that the baby in Eraserhead is made from an embalmed calf fetus. Let me give you a little bit of that wicka remix here. I'm going to take you back, flashback style, through what I just said a second time so you can process it more thoroughly. Rewind. What? So some people believe that David Lynch made this baby out of an embalmed calf fetus. Reaction time. What?
My reaction is that when I first...
Do you believe David Lynch wouldn't use an embalmed calf fetus?
I don't know the man anymore. I'm looking at this situation, and at
He's
first,
not like I used to know him.
I was going to come forward and just say, you know what? The practical effects, the puppetry, it was very fantastic, and that sentiment hasn't really changed.
Yeah.
But the material...
Hey, flesh puppets are puppets too. Things I never thought I'd get to say and record for an audience.
This fact alone is more gross than anything in the film.
It's not a fact.
It's an opinion?
So, asked on how it was made in an interview, David Lynch said, "I don't want to talk about it." Asked again if someone else had made it, he said, "I never said that and I never will. It could have been made by somebody else. It could have been found. Everybody and his little brother now knows how things are done, just like finding out the house wasn't on Sunset Boulevard. Magicians keep their secrets to themselves, and they know that as soon as they tell, someone will say, 'Are you kidding me? That was so simple.' It's terrifying to me that they do that. People don't realize it, but as soon as they hear or see that, something dies inside them. They're deader than they were. They're not, happy to know about this stuff. And they shouldn't know about it. It's nothing to do with the film. And it will only ruin the film. Why would they talk about it? It's horrifying. There are some secrets that, when you learn them, something comes with that learning that is more than the loss of now knowing."
So what you're trying to say to me, David Lynch, is that you made a deal with priests of Dagon, and you have brought a baby fish person onto the set, and you want to cover it up so that no one ever tries to uncover these overall secrets. and thus the overrising of these fish people will one day be upon us.
I'm trying to say I didn't want them to reveal who killed Laura Palmer.
Ah, I see. So another wrong opinion.
So I smushed together a very, very long quote that was in the excerpt. I believe I got this one from the Criterion packaging. They have a little book in there, and there's a section from the Lynch on Lynch book and the interviews from that.
Oh.
So this was like a piecemeal of a few different moments from like one page where Lynch responded this whole giant thing.
Yes.
So
it wasn't in like 30 font and you didn't recite the whole thing.
No. But the thing to kind of keep in mind is that obviously he doesn't want anyone to know how this thing was made, or if he even made it himself, or if someone else made it or found it, whatever. He wants that mystery to be there. And the fact that he would then use this question to pivot into basically a rant about the importance of not knowing these things. I think it puts us in a perilous, interesting position that you and I kind of stumble into by wanting to look at all these special features, is that David Lynch, I get the sense, would much prefer that the behind the scenes, the information about what went on to make this product, it's better not to know. Especially in cases of mystery, we don't want to get that context. It'll kill part of it.
I think that he's being quite presumptuous for the only use of films. I think that he is very much holding on to what he wants to give out and for the films, and that interpretation, that presentation to be the way that he has intended it. I think that we've also seen a form of this with the Dune story.
Mm-hmm.
Which
we'll get more into when we watch the Dune movie.
Yeah, the Dune. It's unfortunate because as someone who not only enjoys learning about the mechanics of things, but say, for example, for those who want to potentially use the mechanics for themselves in the future, it seems like this form of trying to preserve this mystery, this form of preservation, could potentially lead to also avoiding a preservation of continuing that same craft or playing off that craft, remixing things into in a new way. I have mixed feelings on it.
I don't fully agree with what you're saying, but I do understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I think that Lynch is getting to this idea that knowing how the baby was made won't necessarily improve people's enjoyment of the film. Now, of course, we're speaking in generalities.
Yes.
But he's arguing that the majority of people wouldn't actually benefit from knowing that information, that it wouldn't really make it any better or cooler to know how it was made. If anything, it might defeat some of the magic of it. That not knowing how it's made is a sense of wonderment. And it's tough. There was a whole Food Network show about how the food was made. I think Discovery had a how it's made thing. People like to know the behind the scenes. What was the food one called again?
Don't know.
That was, it's going to bother me. Unwrapped. That was the show.
Neat.
Anyway, David Lynch wouldn't necessarily want you to know how these things are made so much as let you believe in the dream world of the fiction and don't get context for it.
Okay.
It also kind of speaks to the way in which in interviews and such, he doesn't really say a whole lot about things. He speaks more in generalities, even more than other cast or crew members on the project.
Okay.
One other quote that kind of reminded me along this similar line, not just about the baby, but also, again, I think it ties into Twin Peaks. Quote, "No matter how strange the world is that you're making a film about, it's gotta be a certain way. Once you say that how that way is, it can't be another way or it's not that place anymore. It breaks the mood or the feeling. So you have these limitations and you have these rules that you have to obey, or else you lose the true feeling of the thing and the audience picks up on this and everything falls apart." So he was talking about Eraserhead in this moment about kind of why certain weird things are in this movie, that even within a weird film, it has to follow the rules or law of the idea. That it has to follow, it's not just pure random. It's articulating more of this thing.
Okay.
And I can't help but think of Twin Peaks and when he brings this up, though.
All right.
That when you have this world, it's got to be a certain way. You break those rules, it ruins the mood of the whole thing. I kind of feel like David Lynch would probably say that happened to Twin Peaks once Laura Palmer's killer was revealed.
He's free to believe that.
I think that's what he feels. I think he said that in other words before.
Okay.
But I don't think it's a stretch to kind of make that comparison that if you don't give the idea the room to breathe, you don't fully realize that idea, you end up with projects that I think you would look at like Dune or Twin Peaks and say they weren't able to fully be their own thing. They got messed with too much. That's my reading of what I think David Lynch thinks.
Very well.
Do you have any thoughts on my thoughts on his thoughts or any thoughts on his thoughts more directly?
There's areas in which I do agree with, but also I believe that the journey to the point I do agree with, but I don't believe in the end result just because of how I feel the art such as film is a bit more complicated. I mean, shifting in tone and shifting in ideas and just playing around with even inconsistencies, I think is as important of a brush than any other stroke made before it. I think that itself is something that we all grow used to whenever it comes to experiencing life itself. So putting that onto film, I think that it's still at times perhaps bold mood, but I wouldn't exclude it from those opportunities. So yes, I'm gaining more and more insight on his overall director style and how he's willing to let things play off as long as it matches these moods.
Yeah.
But on the level of control on it, it makes me genuinely curious. Again, he gives
It's a controlled chaos.
It's a controlled chaos. He lets actors sort of play out on the things that he has arranged, but whenever, say, for example, he steps off set for a bit, and a lot of people are sort of like playing with energy adjacent to that, it could be less to his personal favor.
Which I think it's, again, telling that when Twin Peaks came back, he was the main writer and director. There was no, like, other people involved, really.
Yes.
Like, Mark Frost, to some degree, was involved. We don't know the exact amount. But it wasn't like we saw situations with, like, Robert Engels jumping in and writing or directing, or Todd Holland or one of those people.
Yes.
So I think the focus then on just David Lynch having that sole control, it allowed him to make Twin Peaks what he wanted it to be. Whereas I feel like, once season 2 started and he kind of lost more of that control, I don't know. It's a curious thing.
It's a curious thing for curious people.
Speaking of curious things, the alien baby of this movie, the potential similarity between it and the Squirms, as we've talked about them before.
Yes.
The Squirmy Wormies.
Squirmy wormies.
We're not even sure if it is a baby. Like, Mary herself, when the baby's at the hospital, she's like, we're not even sure. It was born premature, but we have no indication that Mary ever showed signs of being pregnant.
Yes.
Henry didn't expect this happening. The mother and Mary didn't expect this happening. I also got to point out the mother's name is Mary. Mother Mary, having a potentially strange conception. You notice any potential reads you could have on that?
Yes, because that means that the baby is, I forget the story. Is it Judas?
I don't think, I think that would be
Satan?
Henry would be Judas. I don't know.
Is it, I don't know, what's the other wrong answers?
So-
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians.
I think there's an argument to be made here that the name Mary is just too on the nose given the situation at hand. I wouldn't call it an immaculate conception. It does seem like they've done the dirty, although, to be fair, or done the clean. Not trying to shame anyone. But, okay, maybe for Henry and Mary it might have been the dirty. I don't know. In this movie, everything seems like the dirty. But
I don't want to think about, like, doing the clean.
anyway, so, Mr. Clean. Anyway, so...
Oh, no.
Somebody scrubbed his bubbles. Anyway, continuing. Henry doesn't answer when the mom asks, hey, have you and Mary slept together? So there is actually
Not your
room.
business.
There is room to believe then that he didn't actually have sex with her.
But
his name isn't Joseph. His name is Henry.
yes.
So make of that what you will. There was a deleted scene that I don't think was ever shot, so we don't have it actually to... Actually, I know it wasn't shot, so we don't have it to look at. But this would have been where Catherine Coulson would have been in the movie.
Okay.
That's the actor behind the log lady and the amputee. So there's going to be a scene where the parents of Mary were going to pick up Mary at the hospital with the baby. And this disgusted nurse, played by Catherine Coulson, was going to hand them the baby, clearly not happy with this thing she was handing over. It is interesting then that while Henry and Mary do take care of the baby relatively as though it's normal, it is acknowledged in the movie that this is a weird baby. Like, they're not sure it's a baby. This deleted scene, if we consider it canon, would imply that the nurse acknowledges it's a weird-looking baby. they do seem to have some level of awareness that this is not normal, but not nearly the amount we would expect.
I don't even think that we can even say that they're taking care of the baby as normal either.
What would you say if you were describing the baby to someone? What does this baby look like?
The spawn of Jar Jar Binks.
Okay, give me some visceral visual descriptors.
Beak.
Chicken head, right? It's kind of chicken looking.
No.
No?
Like a horse beak.
Did we watch Angel's 8 together?
It's a horse beak.
We watched Angel's 8 together.
Sure, but there's no horse beaks in
You know how in Angel's egg, there's the birdies in the egg?
Yep.
Kind of reminds me of those.
Nope.
Okay, no.
It does not remind you of that.
It does remind me of
that.
that.
It reminds you of horse beak.
Okay, it's very moist. I would say if you were to rub your hand across this baby's head, very moist. I think of it like wet rubber. That's the way I think of it.
I don't want to think about feeling the baby after you said potential cat fetus.
And then calf, not cat.
Either way.
Does that make it more inviting or less inviting? Okay. I mean, would you rather touch a calf fetus or a cat fetus?
Listener, please help me.
Listener, if you'd rather touch a calf fetus or a cat fetus, please let us know.
No.
Our email is snakeeyedreams@gmail.com.
Stop opening.
Our Twitter handle is snakeeyedreams1, as in, which one do you prefer to touch?
Just get away from this while you still can.
And then there's the eyes on the side of the head, right? Very, very curious eyes, squirmy wormies, but they're not wormies, they're just squirmies. And then peculiarly, unlike the other squirmies throughout the film, I say other as though they might be the same species of Jar Jar, this one's got cloth bandages wrapped around its body.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Because the other ones that we see, like the lady in the radiator step on, the one at the beginning from the prologue that dips into the water, none of those have the wrapping. They're just the tendril.
The baby is wrapped up because it's supposed to have a very similar image, say, for example, to a baby being wrapped up in like a blanket or just a series of just
swaddling.
Cloth. It is something that just is a shorthand that shows, hey, this is baby. It also leads into later when something happens to that baby, in which we will get to at the end of the baby time. So I think that this is more so something that can be used symbolically in all ends of the film.
So, like, at first, they take the baby home. We see Mary kind of feeding the baby.
The baby.
Mostly caring for it. I mean, Henry's on the bed, looks over at the wife and kid, and kind of smiles.
You know, it's just
generally okay at first.
Generally okay, and just like seeing Mary deal with what I'll just overall call, since like I believe that this baby is born from his secrets, and there's all sorts of issues that come through it. I'm not saying all babies are like this in general, but this is, I will likely refer to as the problem. When Mary is dealing with Henry's problems, he seems alright content and not really concerned too much, really. It's okay. Meanwhile, Mary is very not having fun with the problem, in which, like, trying to stuff food down the baby and trying to tend to it and take care of the baby, it just doesn't work out.
Well, like, the first time it seems to really bother Henry, it's when he is having one of these, like, radiator fantasies, one of the first ones. He's, like, looking at the radiator, he's kind of smiling, and then we see his fantasy get interrupted by the crying of the baby.
Yep.
And when that happens, you know, it kind of takes him out of the moment. You mentioned later when he's checking the baby later and kind of feeding it, he notices it's acting strange, takes the temperature of the baby. Temperature seems to check okay, but then he looks over and immediately you get the jump scare of the baby bumps, the bumpy babies.
And he just says, like, Henry's just like, oh, he's sick. And no, Henry, he's a strawberry.
And it seems like Henry has no idea what to do if the baby's sick. Now, granted, if I had a baby I was feeding and then I look over and immediately it's full of bumps, I would also be confused about what to do. I probably wouldn't try to leave the apartment. So, like, there's various points where Henry feels like he really wants to leave.
Well,
but he doesn't want to leave the baby behind. Like, the baby will cry and he'll turn around again. He's hesitating to leave.
Well,
he's
already helped because he turned on the humidifier and just sat there.
He straight up was about to leave the baby sick and dying on the table, just casually, if it wasn't for the crying.
He remembered his mailbox. The mail could have came at 2 a.m.
So, in the mail, he gets one of those little squirmy wormies, the squirmies, and puts it in that cupboard, right?
Yep, around the time that Mary is still here.
We get
present.
all the squishing of them. what do we make of the connection between this baby and those things? Are they the same thing? Are they a stand-in for each other? What's going... They look so similar.
Because, again, I believe that the baby is born from his secrets. I believe that there is something of Henry's personality that birthed, and he's just getting packages in that sort of feeds into that. It is something that continues this area of constant secrecy.
See, when I see the lady in the radiator squishing the little squirmies, she's like got this playful expression on her. I feel like that is Henry, like his ideation of murdering his baby. Like, I'm be real with you. I feel like, the lady in the radiator is kind of his daydreaming, his fantasy world, his little hopeful fantasy world. And it's in that moment where she's kind of playing around with the idea of squishing them, and then eventually does and kind of giggles. He's like, dude, I wish I could squish my baby right now.
No, I don't think it's because of the baby. I think that it's because it's at the point of sperm. I think that dealing with what he considers to be, this is not to all babies, this is not to all instances or anything like that, but the way that he kind of, like, this baby is brought in through his secrets and just being his problems, for someone to be able to not only like give a good smile to the point her cheeks are so swollen, and then sort of like deal with something that could become a problem for him. That's the point of ideal that I imagine for Henry.
I take it to mean that as the film goes on, he starts to correlate more and more involuntarily and in the real world any sexual thoughts, any sexual acts with this baby. And not only that, other people start to do the same thing. Most notably, the woman across the hall seeing his head as the baby's head, kind of correlating him to the point where even when he's alone in the bed with Mary, for example, and we see him pulling out these long-tendrilled, long-tailed squirmies from her, clearly it's from her under the sheet, there's this sort of repulsion that he keeps pulling and pulling and pulling, that he can't get away from the fact that, yes, this led to the baby. The baby has recontextualized everything for him, especially the act of sex.
I think that maybe I don't really feel that is as much to the close of the act of sex myself, as strange enough with the sheer amount of sperm throughout this film. I think that as far as this individual scene goes, it's just this baby, this overall thing born from his actions, is just that. It's something that becomes either his secrets that he's got to deal with and try to like tend to, and when it's starting to sort of bother him or get in his way, we see him just sort of like smother the mouth of the baby and in order to even just like try to focus on those points of sexual need. I'd imagine if it was something that was more akin to that, we'd probably get more focus on the baby, more sounds from the baby. But instead, we get more sounds from the baby when he's being that secretive, when he's sneaking out of his room, when he's trying to check up on the woman, and then after that doesn't go so well, the baby becomes all the more louder, because in the end, the baby is his problems.
Well, and if we take the baby as kind of an extension of his guilty conscience, which I think is a direction you could go with what you're saying.
Yes.
There's a moment where later on in the section of my notes I call the end of baby in my notes. There's a moment where the baby is gagging and wheezing. That's what the subtitles say. But to me, it sounded like almost laughing at Henry. Again, subtitles say gagging and wheezing, but the way it was gagging and wheezing sounded a bit like cackling.
Yes.
I don't know if you felt that way or not.
I felt exactly that way.
You did? Okay. That ending part, it feels like it's kind of mocking him. And whether, now the question is the baby actually doing that, or is Henry projecting? Could be either way. Henry at this point is like lying on his bed, and it looks like he's going through a bunch of things in his mind. The wind is howling, the electricity's crackling. We keep hearing, or he keeps hearing, like footsteps, the elevator, noises outside. He's clearly like agitated, bothered. And this is right after, of course, the beautiful girl across the hall rejects him.
Not necessarily that it is seems to be a form of rejection, yes.
She turns away from him toward this other man.
Yes.
And we'll get to more of that later. But as soon as that happens, he closes the door, kind of slumps back against the door, and we see him grab the scalpel. At that point, he's kind of compelled. And he really does hesitate. He does question. He does pause. He does stop.
But for his first true action, he begins to cut away at the overall bandages until it opens up to an overall series of organs.
Which I do
bloody.
think of like the chicken or the turkey. Well, chicken in the movie's case, like what happened at the dinner scene. It does remind me of the inside almost cavity of opening up a chicken. Now, granted, I don't do that. I don't know for sure what that looks like, but that's what I imagine opening up a chicken would look like.
Regardless, it is opening up the chest cavity of this baby, and at the side of this, after a few moments of very big sounds from the baby,
Yeah.
he then strikes at it, and the insides are mashed potatoes, begin growing out, making foam sounds similar to the grandmother.
And there's like this high-pitched kettle whistle kind of occurring at the same time.
Yes.
The baby spits out blood. Henry starts to look away. He's like turning from it almost in shame or disgust.
Yes. I think that as this baby has been stabbed and struck, again using the angle of secrets, even when he opens up his secrets, opens up about the things that are his problems, the biggest thing that happens when it is dealt with, it still leaves a mess.
Right.
There's nothing that you can do in which is just going to cleanly bury this away. It is something that begins to make a very not sanitary result.
So how did you feel about
messy.
this killing of the baby? Like the culminating moment of the whole film. What did you think about this scene? How'd you feel?
It's hard to look at. It had made me avert my eyes onto the second viewing just because a lot of the practical effects are very effective, but it also very much cemented my idea of this is what the baby is. It is the messiness that comes after trying to deal with either your white lies or your things you've hide off to the side, because there is no escaping what you've already done.
Which, I mean, if you want to take it that route too, as soon as he does kill it, you have more of these squirmies around, most notably a gigantic one. This big giant head near the bed that keeps popping out in and out.
Yep.
That almost looks like it's going to like eat him, like it looms over him threateningly.
Yep.
So if we do take it more as a sort of metaphor for secrets, metaphor for guilt, it's coming after him now.
Yep.
And Henry's response to this is mostly just to turn away, to turn his head into the darkness. And what we make of that is kind of debatable. There's a lot of electricity happening here. Electricity.
Yep.
Where we get the lamp electricity sparking, I should say. You get huge sparks shooting out of the sockets. What do you make of the electricity element? Because right before we get kind of the final scenes here, we see a light bulb going out, Henry fading into darkness, the hole blowing up in the planet, and pretty much after that is when the ending scene happens.
I mean, it's, again, one of those David Lynch mood setters. It is something in which things are erratically happening, darkly happening, and going so quickly. I think it is just a mood setter more than anything, trying to reach those tones that he believes that would most consistently fit with the film itself. I think that he has a fondness for things such as electricity, judging by his reactions to things such as electrical plants.
Yes.
But with that fascination, I think he knows how to twist things around where it becomes very horrifying with such passion he has for these pieces.
So do you think, aside from just Lynch's fascination with electricity, do you think symbolically or thematically electricity is important for this moment?
I think that...
Or for the film?
I think that I could probably try to dig into one, but I think that David Lynch has a common use from my two instances of seeing it with
Well,
him.
in the short films, did we get much electricity there?
Well, I think the last one that we found on the DVD of the short film with the...
Premonitions, Following an Evil Deed, Lumiere.
Yep. That had a bit of almost, if not electricity, very mechanical sort of...
I mean, there was an
strangeness
electric
to it.
rod that was seen to be electrocuting the woman inside the tube.
It's hard to tell with electricity for me anyway.
Sure.
Other than that, no real use of electricity from the short films from what I recall. I guess if you interpret the way that it was made and presented, you could say 6 men getting sick on the use of the external projector as well as the wailing sound.
We saw more fire than we did electricity.
We did.
Which, there's not really any fire in Eraserhead. There is a lot of smoke and fog, but not necessarily fire itself.
Yeah, but still sparks can create flame.
Sparks and electricity and fire, they overlap a bit. How similar they are is debatable, but...
You see, it's like a Venn diagram, you see.
It is. I've never heard of a Venn diagram. What is that?
It's a series of circles that overlap, and you can compare things.
So if you were to make a Venn diagram, one circle is Eraserhead's ending,
Yep.
and one circle is a happy ending.
Yep.
Are the circles overlapping completely?
No.
Are they touching?
No.
So you would call this ending worst case scenario almost.
I think that at least Jack might be going out in peace, but I don't think that it's really going to be a good time, judging from the sounds in the background.
So let's talk about the ending in the middle of our podcast. Or what I imagine is the middle. Who knows when we edit it down where this will be. But let's talk about the ending now. So the final shot we get then is of the man, Henry himself, embracing the lady in the radiator and fading to white with large amounts of whoosh crackle noise.
Yep.
Dense noise. Then a hard cut to the credits.
Yep.
So it's open. It's open to interpretation. She's smiling, but she's always smiling. Henry's expression, what would you say it is?
He's Henry.
He is Henry. He's complacent. Let's say that. What do we think here? So we've got kind of two competing, not as even competing, two different but possibly complementing ideas of interpreting this as more on my side. I've been articulating this anxiety and fear about fatherhood that culminates in his wish fulfillment of killing the child that he views as an obstacle and then murdering said child before being haunted by the guilt. Your idea, very similar, but less of it being an actual baby and more of it being a stand-in for the idea of his secrets. Correct?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. So in both of our endings, he either just killed his literal child and or he killed or tried to kill his secrets, and it clearly didn't, it imploded on him.
I think that still, even with it imploding on him, I think that this scene of light, especially with the woman in the movie, of the canon of the movie, saying, in heaven, everything is fine. This is heaven.
He could be dead. He could be literally dead.
It could be death, but he's in heaven. It could be death heaven, or it could be mental heaven. Regardless...
Isn't Death Heaven a band? Like a metal band?
Maybe. He made a choice at the end of the film, which is much more...
Did you get the bad ending or the good ending in this?
He got his ending, which was it's his accomplishment, to say. Whether that is good or bad, I leave it up to genuine interpretation. I think that him making an active choice for himself, though, instead of going on with the flow of everyone around him, as well as probably his bit of escapism and just trying to fully escape his situation, he was able to ascend and be met with an embrace of something that I imagine gives him either comfort or something adjacent. And with that, though, we don't really see much to follow afterwards other than the spooky sirens that lead to going straight to black.
I don't think of it as sirens, but yeah, I do know what you mean. I think there's a case we made that he literally could be dead. That's not how I interpret it.
Just cut to black. Death. Goodbye. So long, so well. Friend.
Because if we associate the thing that happened before with the electricity going all crazy, the sparks going all crazy, I don't think it's hard to believe he
dim and stopping of the bulb, which turns dark.
It could be that he just got electrocuted. It could be that the reason why he's in this white space is because he literally got electrocuted.
In heaven, everything's fine. And honestly, that's probably where his headspace wants to be, because again, he's very passive. If everything's fine in heaven.
Now, I don't know if this is 100% apt because I haven't experienced these feelings, but I do wonder if for someone who's experienced like disassociation or depersonalization, if this would feel like a potential analog for that at the end.
Okay.
Because I do get the sense that he is leaving his physical body space, that there's kind of a sense of distancing himself from the situation at hand.
Very well.
And again, if we take that looming giant-headed squirmy to be squirmy with the W, I keep saying it the wrong way, but squirmy.
Yeah.
When we take that to be guilt or the overwhelming fear of what's happening, the fact that he turns his face away into darkness, if he's not dead, he could be retreating or retracting into a sort of state of denial almost, or just exiting the reality of the situation.
All right.
I don't know how that idea holds up for you. That's more where I lean. I don't think he literally got electrocuted, but I also think that it's possible.
It certainly is possible, whether it is physical electrocution or metaphorical.
Do you think if Henry died and he got electrocuted, do you think the beautiful girl across the hall would go to his funeral?
No.
So in the credits, she's known as the beautiful girl across the hall. I think she's more of a woman than a girl. I don't know if that matters.
I don't think it matters whatsoever.
She's not a lady, though. The lady's in the radiator.
Yes.
So their first meeting, the beautiful girl across the hall, she lives in apartment number 27. She opens the door and she's wearing like this kind of partly exposed front top, and she asks if he's Henry. So second situation of someone asking if he's Henry after the mom did it earlier in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Or before. I'm getting my order mixed up.
You are.
She asked it first, then the mom later.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if we're going by your affair idea, it is noteworthy that the other person who says, "Are you Henry?" is the mom.
Ha.
Something you could do there.
Something you could do. Especially since that person was also a beautiful woman.
There's also a point later when the baby is at home and is sick. We, the viewer, briefly see the beautiful girl across the hall, like in the hallway, but Henry isn't out there with her. I thought that was kind of an interesting little like glimpse.
Okay.
I don't know what to make of that, but there's that moment where Henry's not out there, but we see her. Did you have any thoughts on that?
No, really. In fact, I completely forgot about it.
It happens for like 2 seconds, and then it's just back.
2 seconds.
It's a strange little situation. This preludes their second meeting later when Henry has a knock on his door.
And she emerges from the darkness.
I really thought that was effective.
Which is great, because if it is at the same level of when we opened the door, that means that she's kneeling down at the doorknob before walking in.
Isn't that what you always want to believe would happen?
Yep, exactly that way, especially since it seems the electricity is out from the hallway.
And she says that she's locked herself out of her apartment, and it's so late. Also, her outfit, she's got a floral pattern on the dress.
For whatever reason.
For whatever reason, flowers. And obviously it's open again, more exposing. And when she asks where the wife is, again, Henry doesn't know. He seems to be very confused, bewildered.
And
she's so close to him based on the camera movement and where we see her that he's just kind of backing away a bit as she's talking.
Which, by the way, during like her first entry into the room, like he is covering the mouth of the child as soon as a little bit starts to bubble up. Again, almost as if he's hiding something, even though it should be very blatant that he has maybe a baby inside the room.
So she asks if she could spend the night there, and we get a cut to them then kissing inside of a crater filled with, again, what looks like white liquid.
In the bed.
Naked. With the woman looking occasionally at the crying baby.
Yep, and...
Which I read the look as wary, is the way I kind of, not quite afraid, but like, she seems to be wary of this
She's
thing.
becoming more aware of the baby, which may or may not be the problems.
Which I take the fact that they then submerge into the liquid, I take that as a narrative shorthand for sex. If you want to go more on the physical side, possibly that moment of ejaculation.
Potentially. It does look like she is going in secondarily into it as her hair sort of floats upon the surface.
And this is the moment where when she kind of just sees something, which, again, I wonder if she's not seeing, again, the planet, the baby head sort of situation, it cuts to the in heaven, everything is fine.
Yep.
So curious that the in heaven, everything is fine is associated with this moment of the affair.
It is the aftermath. It is something in which when one has a chance to breathe after the actions, it is probably something that feels relieving and thus is post-climax a very apt...
There's a euphoria associated with the appearances of her. Again, there's a lot of things you could try to armchair psychoanalyze about this. What Henry's fixation on this one radiator is very curious.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is interesting that is the moment that song plays. And then the last encounter we have of her, again, is where she's with that balding man. He's got like almost like a dark, wettened cheek. Something going on with his cheek there.
Yep.
And he seems pretty bothered by the fact that when she's with this guy, she doesn't really seem like she wants to do with him very much. She's kind of just with this other guy right now. And we get a cut of what's presumably her perspective, seeing the baby head on his shoulders.
Yep.
Which I take to be very clearly meaning that when she looks at him now, she sees the baby.
Yep.
That she thinks, this guy is tied down to this baby. I don't want that in my life.
I don't think that's tied down per se, but I do think that he is basically the baby.
Do you have...
Again, with that, as I repeat myself, please take a shot. Please don't actually take a
Please
shot. Of being his little dirty pile of secrets.
I've heard dirty little pile. I've heard like dirty little secret. I've heard
Dirty secret, dirty little secret, dirty pile of secrets.
One of those All-American
Pile of
Reject
secrets.
songs, yeah.
Yes, regardless, He is what he has made and put into the world, and from the face of disgust that she has when realizing, or just like can't really disassociate him from that, it seems that nothing is going to continue from there.
He's made his bed, and now he's going to soak in it.
Ugh.
So anything else on the beautiful girl across the hall?
No.
Okay, so the next figure we've mentioned plenty, but we got a little bit more to talk about, is the lady in the radiator. So regarding this character, David Lynch said, and I quote,
You will quote,
"The lady in the radiator wasn't in the original script. I was sitting in the food room one day, and I drew a picture of the lady in the radiator, but I didn't know where it came from. But it was meaningful to me when I saw it finally drawn. So I ran to the set and looked at the radiator more closely. You know, there are many different types of radiators, but I'd never seen a radiator like this. It had a little kind of chamber, like a stage in it. It was right there, and it just changed everything. So then I had to build the doors and the stage and do the whole thing. One thing led to another, and there she was." Which, if you look at, in the movie, the radiator does have a weird little compartment.
Yep.
Which, again, coincidence and fate figure largely in David Lynch's filmography.
I think that it aids because I think David Lynch puts an aspect of himself into someone like Henry for like looking for those points of fascination and sort of falling into it. And I think it's very fitting.
Now, a surprising amount of interpretation is put here. Lynch did say a little bit more about the lady in the radiator, more than I think he usually reveals about things. Quote,
"Oh, please tell me more about the baby." No. "Oh, please tell me more about the cheeky lady." Well,
"The lady in the radiator had bad skin. I think she had bad acne as a child and used a lot of pancake makeup to smooth that out. But inside is where the happiness in her comes from. Her outward appearance is not the thing." So you kind of made a comment, we were talking about it off pod, that she smiles so much it's made her cheeks puff up.
Yep.
He says, according to his interpretation, she used a lot of pancake makeup to smooth out the bad acne as a child.
Yep.
I like your interpretation more. I'm not going to lie. But it's interesting
I'm right, David Lynch. Who do you think you are?
It's interesting to note, though, that he says that the outward appearance is not the thing, which is very funny when clearly she has a notable outward appearance. So it's like David Lynch is saying, look at those cheeks. Ha, I tricked you. That's not the thing. It's just, again, kind of funny for him to say what's not the thing.
Yeah.
Feels strangely interpretive of David Lynch to just tell us that.
Yes.
I wonder if it's a mislead in some ways. I don't know. I don't trust him very much. Sometimes I wonder about you, David Lynch. What are you planning? Also, more in curiosity. So back to the radiator itself. It's got that chamber, but then like in front of it, there's like stuff.
Yep.
I couldn't tell what it is. Is it like thin wires? Is it grass?
Oh, it looks like grass, like some shavings, if you will.
Because I couldn't tell if it was wires or grass. Again, blurring the line between mechanical, electrical.
It looks like dirt and overall grass. That looks like shavings that you'd have after sort of weed whacking the area.
So why is that in front of the radiator?
It's probably, again, tied towards things that are natural, things that are good. But at the same time, it makes me fear that the overall place is a fire hazard.
Which, I mean, if we take the death ending as a possibility.
Yep.
Who's to know?
God.
So, who's in the planet maybe right now? Inside the actual radiator stage, whether you imagine it to be real or just Henry's idea.
For all the instances that seemed real.
It's got a spotlight in the center, curtains, kind of a checkerboard floor pattern. Anything notable about the stage or the presentation of that?
Everything's set up in the stage that will appear later. So in this case, we got the little bars off to the side with a small little curtain. We got the nice little archway. Again, those light bulbs that you mentioned before. It is a constructed place that does not change.
I think the use of it being a stage is notable. Like if we take it as important within the fiction itself and not just a convenient coincidence of Lynch noticing something on a radiator, is that means that she is an actor on the stage. She's a performer, that there's some element of what she's doing is implying an audience and she's performing for that audience.
Okay.
That's a pretty specific element then of what she is.
Yeah.
That this is something that she's putting on a show, and then later on Henry steps onto that stage and almost becomes part of that show himself. There's something you can do with that, especially given the amount of like metafiction layers Lynch likes to employ sometimes. Saying that, just thought it was interesting. Also, the lady herself, she's got a flower on her waist.
I feel like there's something like a theme going on.
Maybe.
Here.
Possibly.
I couldn't put my flower on it though.
What did you think of the "In Heaven Everything Is Fine" song?
In heaven, everything is fine. That's what I thought. In heaven, everything is fine. If you want a larger description, seeing as you aren't even giving me eye contact now.
Looking at my notes.
It's a haunting but still calming tune. It's something that I'm not dissuaded from it being reassuring, but the deep organ sound in the background certainly makes it seem like that music after a tragedy, if you will.
It's eerie. You know what I mean? It's eerie visually. I think the darkness of it makes it just potentially problematic and disturbing. And then, the contents of it, just the repetitive nature of it, this sort of assuaging, like any sense of worry. Like, it's weird. It's like, it's technically what she's saying is very reassuring, right? Like, don't worry, in heaven, everything is fine. But the situation, again, especially if we read it as a guy dealing with his secrets and his guilt, it takes this sort of idea of just burying everything else. Like, just don't worry, in heaven, everything's fine. Like, there's kind of a menacing quality to that.
Yeah.
And then she says, you've got your good things and I've got mine. Which, what do you take of that part of the song then?
Well, kind of like that. I guess there's a bit of isolation that sort of comes from a statement like that. I mean, as much as Henry's already usually isolated with himself, just kind of focusing on the self. Why care about trying to put together everything around him when he's hardly got things put together for himself? He just wants to be alone, likely,
and left
alone.
Yeah, the sort of seclusionary element in his personality.
Yep.
It's, there's sort of this unwillingness to commit to sharing his life with a wife or child.
There's not an
What even
unwillingness
life there
like to
even is.
commit. It's just that in words, he absolutely does not want it. He'll
Right.
go along with the flow if he needs to.
Sure, you're right. It's just not what he wants, and he won't actually say it.
Yes.
If you want to add more fuel to the fire, by the way,
Ha.
on the interpretation that Henry does die at the end, I think it's notable that when Henry takes the hands of the radiator lady early in the film, when he takes her hands, there's like a white flare on the screen. Then he pulls away, touches again, more white flare. So there's association with touching her hands with the white flare.
Yeah.
Well, if at the end there's so much sparking electricity coming from the outlet and the radiator is an electrical device, I kind of want to believe that Henry could just reach over and touch the radiator and he got eclipsed by the white light, so to speak. And the white light that takes you to heaven.
Yeah.
Again, I it's not necessarily what I believe, but I'm like, there's a decent amount of evidence that so much electricity association with her
Yeah.
that she could be like a Thanatos death drive kind of thing. This call to the void. Because she's the one who potentially gives him the idea in his head of killing the baby. That there's this sort of call to death that she represents. The freedom of just escaping it. Which, again, is really dark territory if we take it as him purposefully seeking that out.
Yeah.
So on the stage, we obviously see the lady from the radiator. At one point, kind of wheeled in almost on its own, there's this mound of dirt looking like a science fair project on a cart.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to do with that other than the fact that there's mound of dirt everywhere.
There's mounted dirt everywhere.
I don't know. You got anything with the mound of dirt? It gets wheeled in very, noticeably.
It looks like the overall thing he has on his bedside. So you go ahead and tell me what you interpret that to be, and it's the same thing.
Planting a seed?
It does not have a pot.
I know. It's not a good foundation for the child.
It was a good enough foundation for the child and the grandmother, so why is it not here?
The grandmother and, well, the grandmother wasn't a baby. The grandmother was the grandmother.
Grandmother was the grandmother, but the baby, it might not be the baby.
If Henry had produced a fully grown grandmother, this would never happen.
It is a plant that is growing out off on his bedside, now much larger inside of this psyche towards the end of the dream after the whole head pop off thing and everything.
I don't know. The mound of dirt is honestly one of the things I'm most struggling with, but it
Yeah.
also goes back to the overall theme of the soil, the plants, and I don't know where to put all the pieces together fully myself.
I think that the biggest thing, if I will,
You will. You must.
what does a pot do for a plant?
Provides shelter and shape.
It provides structure, if anything.
Yes.
And what's the one thing that it seems this world does not have, especially Henry?
Color. It's all black and white.
No, because it's also like that's still consistent with like a pot inside this movie because we do see one later.
I think you want me to say structure.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I said the right thing.
There you go. You did it. You did it, Fran. Give yourself a pat on the back. You won Eraserhead.
I will say there's probably not a lot of structure in his life because inside of that stage, he starts turning a pipe over and over again in his hands until his head pops off and a baby head emerges in its place.
Yeah, because that's the thing that's sort of left behind. His body is just kind of moving along with the motions, doing tasks that just sort of spin around in circles, do not propel him forward, just is a mild distraction for anything. And at that point, the birth and the preservation of the baby remains, while any sort of potential function that he could have outside of it, where his overall head is at, is gone. It is removed and jutted out because there's no need for it anymore. You could almost say that it even is a replacement for who he was if you were to take the angle of what his parenting would become.
David Lynch had a child around this time. Just going to keep saying that. It's going to bring that up. Make of that what you will.
Make of it whatever you will.
So after his head pops off, it soaks in this sort of liquid that looks like blood, right?
It's gravy.
And it sinks into the one moment,
Sinks into the
plopping
gravy.
onto the pavement concrete below.
And losing the scalp.
And this man credited as just bum in the credits kind of looks over and watches then as the boy, as he's known in the credits, runs over, grabs the head, and brings it over to a nearby shop of some kind.
Yep, where we see potted plants in the windowsill.
Which makes it seem like this is the least real thing of all, right? Or the most real. Who's to say?
It's the most structured place.
And inside the situation, there's a man at the counter named Paul.
Yep, we know his
And
name is Paul because...
he summons this boss over.
Yep, and what does the boss do?
The boss says, after incessant buzzing drove him to this point, "Okay, Paul!"
Yep. It seems like he's upset.
And so Paul at one point wants to go with the boss and the boy as they are going to go inspect the head that has been retrieved, but he makes sure to tell him that no, Paul needs to go back.
This man
to
is
the
very
counter.
excited to see the head, and this boy bring in the head.
The Eraserhead, one could say.
Yep.
Because it is then, I don't think it's really shown to be hooked up to anything, but it's heavily implied that somehow they're making pencils out of the head and testing them.
They're making... No, the pencils are there. He has pencils loaded up at the top and shakes them out. It's just that this is something that puts the erasers on the ends of the pencils.
Which, I'm curious what you interpret this whole scene is, because in a movie that's very strange, this is one of the strangest parts.
Aha, no, this is an easy one. This is an easy time. I'm sorry, Kalil. I've solved Eraserhead. I'm the one who knows all the answers. I won the David Lynch.
You win the game.
I won. I will win, but I also won. Time. Anyway, so the child brings it over, and that is when we get a little bit of the inside of the brain taken out. The Eraserhead portion.
Yes.
And that noodle is placed into the machine, loading up into these overall erasers, in which they do test out the eraser at one of the heads that it keeps producing.
It's just like PB&J Otter always said, use your noodle, do the noodle dance.
Exactly. Disney, old show, cartoon. Anyway.
I'm still topical and fresh with the references.
You're not. It's just that, music, I know obscure cartoons. So
we're speaking the same language when it comes to PB&J Otter.
Yep.
I don't know if anyone else is speaking that language.
No one ever.
Anyway, continue with your Valiant points.
We're the only two viewers of that.
I was going to say valid and salient. I turned it into valiant. It applies. Continue.
Better than Valium. Anyway, after it sort of loads through and they get a chance to test it and just sort of lead in a stroke, he tries to erase it. And the answer is, it's okay. It's not great, not its work. It's okay. That is the quality that they're coming out with it. What I feel is important is to know His job as the printing area, his overall reaction to the outside world, and the fact that his head is profitable in this way to these people. I find people like Henry, to people such as the boss, having someone be so passive and just sort of filling in these strokes and not being able to move up or anything like that, they are simply stuck, is the perfect aid to their needs, if you will, if it is like medial labor, or to just
He's
try
a
to
cog
help.
that fits the machine.
Exactly. He is someone that is going to fit the needs and do exactly what he needs to do because there's nowhere else he's going, and he can produce the most possible amount of product that is necessary.
I think it's also notable with the idea of an eraser, that the eraser is known for eliminating, erasing, removing.
I think that's...
Considering that he's about to go erase his baby from existence after the scene, I think you could argue, if not judging his soul or his worth to corporations or to the cog in the machine.
Which the worth is okay.
Worth is okay, it's fine. You could argue that at this point, his mind is consumed with the idea of erasing, of eliminating, not just necessarily the baby itself or the obstacle, the problem, if you will.
Yeah.
But if we do take the more dark route, the idea of veering toward destruction, veering toward erasing. I mean, what's in a name, right? The movie is called Eraserhead. This seems to be the Eraserhead moment.
Yep.
The moment his head is turned into eraser. So
Yes.
I think that this is the weighing of his soul.
I think it is a weighing of his soul, perhaps, but I think most importantly, it is to emphasize when you actually think about an Eraserhead.
Yeah.
Now, when you're erasing something, when you draw something down, is it completely removed?
No.
No, there's remnants behind. Not only is there usually something left behind on the page, even lightly, unless you took the lightest of strokes, there's also the bits of eraser that are also left behind that are emphasized in moments during the film.
Scattering to a whoosh.
Scattering into a whoosh and lifted into the air.
Cool
No
effect.
matter what, even when you try to erase things, even if you try to keep these secrets, even if you try to go off on that passable note, there will still be things left behind. It's going to be messy, likely, one way or another.
I think people are really going to dig your inputs and observations on this one, Professor.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Thanks.
Aw.
I didn't want your gratitude.
Too bad. It's right there. It's right next to the baby.
So I think at this point we've covered every event, character, situation in the movie itself as pertaining to the main cast.
Yes.
The next sections I have for us to discuss are more about the settings and the kind of the outside worlds. So both of the city itself as well as the apartment.
Yeah.
Is there anything involving anything else you wanted to talk about before we jump into these last few points? You're looking at me as though there is not.
I'm just looking at you as in we have asked many times on towards me on whether or not I need to move forward. And I say, yippee-ki-yay, let us go forward through the pencil hole and make sure that we twist ourselves around so we become sharp and filled with wits. And the lead inside of our heads leads us forward in order to strike down on any sort of preconceptions or ideas that only we are in charge of. We are the masters of our own destiny. We are the beliefs within our own bodies itself. Allow us to be the ones who strike first as I embed a pencil straight into the neck of society.
So David Lynch spent 5 years living in Philadelphia.
Yep.
He describes living there as an atmosphere of, quote, violence, hate, and filth. He said it was an area rife with crime, and he saw things he really couldn't believe. Now, regarding the movie Eraserhead, he said, quote, this is sort of a Philadelphia film. Philadelphia, to me, is a city that is really filled with fear. It's sort of a decaying, violent place. One of the deleted scenes, just to emphasize this point, would have had this group of kids killing a cat with a piece of wire. Henry is then going to walk by and trip on the wire as kind of like an after effect of that scene.
Okay.
Now, David Lynch has also said that the protagonist of Eraserhead, i.e. presumably Henry, although he did just say the protagonist, which is a curious wording, quote, is living under the influence of those things that existed for me in Philadelphia. There was a sense of dread pretty much everywhere I went. I didn't live in any good parts of Philadelphia, and so the dread was my general feeling. I hated it, and also I loved it. So, Philadelphia, born and raised. I don't think he was born and raised there. He did live there for a little bit. I have not lived in Philadelphia. This is not to slander the good name of Philadelphia. Philly, I've heard of your cheesesteaks. I don't know anything else about you. I'm sure you're probably not as bad as David Lynch felt. Maybe you are. Don't know.
You're a vegetarian.
I've heard of the cheesesteaks. Didn't say I indulged in them. Probably have vegan or vegetarian cheesesteaks. Like with like tempeh or tofu or something. Or some sort of meat replacement.
Sure.
Anyway, continuing what I was saying, he seems to put a lot of stock in the idea that the city we're sort of seeing in Eraserhead is like Philadelphia.
Born and raised.
Now, really, most of this film was shot in L.A., if not all of the film was shot in L.A.
You mean they couldn't afford to constantly fly to Philadelphia?
They did not do that, no. It seems like they had barely any money for anything, to be honest. Any thoughts in particular about the Philadelphia angle, that sort of biographical element that's at play here, that David Lynch had lived in Philadelphia with his wife and that they literally used their home address in Philadelphia as the house of Mr. and Mrs. X?
The sheer amount of fondness that he usually shares with items that are usually negative inside of things such as his films, even with him implying negative attributes to that area, and also seeing his excitement at seeing things such as when he was filming Eraserhead. I don't think I could properly articulate on what the feelings are when I can't even keep track of David Lynch's feelings.
He can hate something and call it like this abysmal area of fear and crime and then be like, I love it.
Yep.
So there is that sort of weird inward tension between there to find sort of areas of decay very beautiful.
Yes.
In their own way. When asked why David Lynch loved the idea of Eraserhead, he said, quote, "It was the world. In my mind, it was a world between a factory and a factory neighborhood.
Yep.
A little unknown, twisted, almost silent lost spot where little details and little torments existed, and people were struggling in the darkness. They're living in those fringe lands, and they're the people I really love." This is around the same part where David Lynch commented that Henry and his wife are people he sees as caught in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And he also made this comment that he imagines the city in Eraserhead as being the kind of place that, like, after 5 p.m., you don't see anyone outside in the city. Just kind of empty, other than, again, maybe the occasional brawl out in the streets. Speaking earlier to ideas of electricity, Lynch claims he doesn't know why he uses electricity in a lot of his work. He says he just happens to like it a lot, especially electricity from the 1930s and 40s when it was louder and not as quiet as modern technology. He kind of liked that big sort of smokestack era and fire sort of idea.
You could almost call it quite the buzz.
But he does say, quote, "If you were blindfolded and drove down a highway under those power lines and really concentrated, you could tell when they occurred.
Yep, because you probably hit it.
There's something very disturbing about that amount of electricity. They know these things now. A tumor grows in the head. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not, whacking you."
David Lynch, take the blindfold off. This is dangerous.
So there's this sort of, raw power element to electricity that he seems to think of as this unseen force that's still felt all around.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, just kind of accumulating some pieces of quotes and trivia that I thought were interesting for building the world of Eraserhead. As far as things we observed, what are things that stood out to you about the city of Eraserhead, the outside world?
Brazil? I think I've said Brazil. Brazil.
Terry Gilliam's
Terry
Brazil.
Gilliam's
Not
Brazil.
the country.
Not the country. Potentially the country. I haven't been.
Haven't been. Is the country of Brazil like Philadelphia?
Maybe it is just like Brazil is not just the idea of this film, but it's also, it's just a continuation. They just filmed Brazil. They just filmed Brazil itself.
Good movie.
Good movie. Anyway, no, I think that the very industrial feel, I think the lack of individuals, especially if I do not think that the kids would have added too much other than just being needlessly cruel. I think that the overall feel of emptiness in this area and the fact that there is such things as prized as dirt on people's walls.
Yeah.
Is very effective because it just leaves the viewer likely wondering, gods, what happened?
I think almost the sheer lack of people does a lot for characterizing too, because we hardly see anyone outside.
Yep.
And one time we do is when Henry's looking out his window and he sees that one guy beating up the other guy in a brawl out night.
Makes no sense.
Considering that he had a wall of bricks in front of his window before that.
Man, it's so nice that someone removed the bricks from his wall.
Again, is that literal? Were the bricks really there? Were they not really there? Who knows?
Who knows who's where?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of character development happening with the outside world. I think it's sort of a dark, gross place in general. Outside of the Mr. and Mrs. X house, there's just this, I don't know what it is causing all the steam, but there's some kind of electric or industrial element right next to their house.
Yep.
Do you know what that is?
Nope.
Me neither.
It is industrial, and that's all that matters at the end of the day, because the sheer sounds and the overall use of imagination from that point on is all that really matters at the end.
And I wouldn't say that the apartment that Henry lives in is necessarily any cozier. I mean, I guess it's better than being out in the concrete deathland.
Hey, Kalil.
Yes.
Hey, Kalil.
Yes.
Chevron.
So inside the lobby area of the apartment where the elevator is, sort of a dark, intimate lighting, chairs and lamp, and notably the pattern on the floor, chevron that Lynch would later reuse, obviously, for Twin Peaks in the waiting room, the red room of the Black Lodge area. Who knows?
And since we are going through his filmography, I'm sure chevron will never come up again.
Probably not.
Not once.
No.
Not twice. Never. Except Twin Peaks.
You and I both commented off pod as well that we like how the doors to the elevator are fake.
They are fake. They are very much fake.
It's that interesting realm where this film operates a lot of times that it's clearly artificially constructed as a set, but it's real fake.
Yep, it's
real fake doors.
It is something in which it unnaturally moves. The design on it feels very lumpy and melted. And when they sort of move away, it feels less like I'm going into an apartment and more so going into hell.
There's like that moment where we get like this stop motion. It's like the Squirmies, but it's like a little slug looking little thing that makes like noises.
Yep.
And moving in the craters. I feel like that is able to work so well because the movie, even though it's not mostly stop motion, it has that feeling of semi-real, kind of not real element that when you suddenly go to stop motion Squirmy, it doesn't feel that odd.
Yep.
It just kind of fits the tone.
I think it also helps that with the limited color palette of black, white, and gray all over, it all just feels very like it's packed up in a delicious little lunchbox. And that was simply an additional dessert, maybe a little bit of a cheese or a cracker or an Oreo.
And this lunchbox getting pretty tight and cramped in here.
It is very cramped.
Because when you go up to Henry's floor on the apartment building, that hallway is like super narrow.
Yep.
Like super, super narrow. They have room for a payphone, a hanging lamp, but you can't have two people pass each other in that hallway.
Nope.
By the way, the most interesting of the deleted scenes, in my opinion, there was going to be a deleted... Well, there wasn't going to be a deleted scene. It was a scene that got deleted. There was going to be a scene that was shot. It was made where Henry heard noises coming down the hall in the apartment. He would go to investigate and look into the room. And when he got there, he would see two women tied up on a bed and a man with a cigar approaching them, holding some kind of box that's like crackling electricity. And then the women spot Henry. He just runs back to his room. So that almost got an Eraserhead. It was shot. Lynch just decided it was a little too dark and disturbing for the content of the film.
Oh.
You know, in this otherwise non-disturbing, non-dark film.
Mm-hmm. It's still heavily dark, and I do kind of see somewhat of it, just because, again, it may emphasize a little bit more on Henry's, again, lack of action. But at the same time, it seems like an extra bit of everything else we're getting in the film that I don't see why I would necessarily need it. But at the same time, I'm also asking myself, what does a box of electricity look like?
I'm also curious, given the description I just read, were the women there consensually or not? I would assume if it was seen as such a dark scene, they must not have been there. It must have been like a really bad situation that Henry just leaves.
Like, it could be all sorts of feelings I could have on this. Like, if it's like a box that has like that little like central orb and electricity is crackling, that would be threatening. If it was a box and it was just closed and just electric sounds came from it, that would be threatening. If it was a Game Boy, like the classic Game Boy that's very boxy, less threatening.
Well, you could just go for a GameCube. That's
GameCube
a cube
was not
shape.
out, and Game Boy was not out.
Game Boy was not out either.
GameCube.
You thought Game Boy was out in 1977?
It also is in black and green. I was going to say black and white, but that was a lie. It was a green screen.
Maybe it's a toaster. Maybe it's just a toaster. What is toaster if not electric box? Or microwave?
No, it has microwaves, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's electric. You need electricity for a microwave to work.
Likely.
Okay, anyway, continuing. Then we have Henry's apartment itself inside of the apartment. Number 26 is where he lives.
Henry's apartment inside of the apartment.
Yes.
Mhm.
I am
He's got
articulate.
a little box.
You're the one who told me I was the wordsmith here, okay?
Wordsmith of words.
There's a lot of things we've already kind of touched upon, so I'm not going to reheat this burrito, so to speak. I'm just going to leave the burrito cold from an hour ago. But some things that are around here. The bed sheets on Henry's bed, they're all tattered and torn. There's a scene we get later where Henry's like picking at the holes, which leads you to believe that either he creates the holes by his fidgeting or he makes the holes worse through the fidgeting. To the side of the bed, we have that nightstand with the mound of dirt. We've talked about that, but then above the mound of dirt is a picture on the wall. What is the picture on the wall above the mound of dirt? Small little picture, framed above the mound of dirt. Really? I actually thought for sure you would identify this one.
I was identifying all sorts of other things.
It is a mushroom cloud.
It's a mushroom
From like
cloud.
an atomic bomb.
Ooh, mushroom.
Just
cloud.
Just a curious mushroom cloud bomb that feels really jarringly obviously there.
Which I find interesting that mushroom cloud is a very easy way to describe it because, yes, it does look like those things, but mushroom cloud, it sounds so much more pleasant than what's actually happening.
Well, and I think at one level you could interpret it as being more of that epitome of conflating the natural with the man-made.
Yeah.
You've got the man-made chickens during dinner. You've got all the soil versus the wires and everything.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, to be fair, plant has two meanings, right? There's a plant that's like a flower or a leafy vegetable or whatever. There's also the industry plant.
Yep.
There's a plantation of machinery.
Pleasant names.
I don't know. I think that dual meaning of plant comes to mind here. That a mushroom cloud brings to mind the idea of the shape of a mushroom, a fungus, an organic growth, but then it's made by man-made efforts of war and violence.
Yep.
Ultimately born of fire as well.
Walk with me.
There's a lot of things you could do with the mushroom cloud. I'm only going to say those at least. Inside that top drawer of his dresser, we have a pot of water inside that he likes to drop coins in. I think of it like a wishing well, but like poor man's wishing well.
Poor man's wishing well. He can make wishes at this time.
He has two halves of a torn photo of Mary.
Probably, why was it torn?
Now, I think it's not hard to stretch to believe that the top drawer, it is a literal top drawer, but also kind of represents like maybe part of his consciousness or thoughts.
Yeah.
That he has a fractured, torn image.
Wishful thinking for the pot.
Right. Put a few coins in the wishful pot.
Patunk, patunk.
Yeah, everything else I think I have on here we have talked about earlier.
But
and bears no
Kalil,
repeating.
I asked you to answer a question.
What?
Why do you think the photo was torn?
Oh,
I think it's important that the photo is torn.
go on.
Well, obviously, there was already issues with the overall relationship. When do you tear a photo?
When you're angry at someone.
Yeah, in the privacy of his own home, no less.
Maybe he saw the photo and he's like, man, I wish I had two photos of my beautiful girlfriend. If
I'll
I rip this
strip
one
it
in
at the
half,
neck.
I have two photos. And then he realized, oh no, that doesn't work.
And then the womp womps happen.
Womp, womp, womp.
Yeah, no, I think that he's genuinely angry, and there's just nothing really great going on other than obligation.
But he doesn't throw it away.
He does not throw it away. In fact, there's something that I'm kind of thinking on, I'd like to extend upon.
Please
Looking
extend.
back.
Extend.
Hey, remember that time in which he was having bad dreams inside this very room with this very person that he has a torn photo on?
Yes.
And there is, like, she's sort of, like, wiggling around in
Like
the
a
blankets.
cocoon.
On.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe a cocoon, but kind of like wrappings, if you will. Wrappings similar to the baby. In fact, she's kind of making...
She's my wife.
She's-
wrapped in curtains. Not curtains, bed sheets. What are bed sheets if not curtains?
But she's wrapped up similar to the baby. She's making mouth movements like the baby, and she's very moist like the baby.
She also is producing things that look like babies from under the bed sheet.
Yep, like the baby. The baby in the film is known for producing more
Well,
babies.
you know what I mean. I'm saying there's a similarity there.
I mean, like, he does produce more babies after being stabbed.
So, hard segue here.
Hard stab way.
So, we've postulated some ideas in Eraserhead. No doubt, listener, you have plenty of your own. We would be very curious and interested if you wanted to drop some of your own interpretations or thoughts on Eraserhead in the YouTube comments for this, or again through email or Twitter. snakeeyedreams@gmail.com. snakeeyedreams1 at Twitter.
The numeral one.
Numeral 1 is in. One more of your thoughts would be great. Maybe more than one. I don't know. But ultimately, we don't think that there is one answer to Eraserhead. There's not like one, you crack the code, you did it. We'll joke. But am I correct, Professor, in saying that we believe that this is ultimately a work that is purposefully open to interpretation?
Yes.
To a very large degree.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of what makes it fun, is that sense about it.
Fun?
So I got a few things to say regarding this open to interpretation element of the film. Will you indulge me on that?
Very well. Tell us how we're wrong.
So Jack Nance.
Yep.
1990 interview for the Twin Peaks fan magazine Wrapped in Plastic.
Neat.
He said, quote, "You guys get way too deep over this business. I don't take it all that seriously. It's only a movie." So Jack Nance has continuously said, like, it's just a movie. He doesn't really think about it that deep.
Okay.
He doesn't want to get that deep into things.
I think that maybe in a different way of deepness, mainly because if I can, I think that there might be maybe not a pronounced or verbalized form of it, but kind of like how David Lynch was talking about the baby, the form of the baby, and how people are trying to find more out about the baby, and that sort of takes away the magic. I think maybe there might be somewhat of that in that sort of response for Jack Nance, that something is a movie.
I think there's a slight but important difference between the two sentiments.
Yeah.
Wondering what the baby represents or what it is for the movie, I think David Lynch would be totally on board with.
Yeah.
It's wondering how it's made in real life that David Lynch objected to.
I'm not saying that their thoughts are necessarily the same, but I think that there's still a school of thought that can go into this, in which trying to dig too far somewhat destroys the magic.
The Sam Stanleys of the world don't necessarily get as far.
I'm sorry, but that's wrong, because I still like to do exactly these things.
And you have made it completely where you want to be.
Yeah, I feel like I'm being insulted
The professor
here.
just starts weeping uncontrollably.
I have been.
This whole podcast, you've been crying uncontrollably?
Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't matter the tone of my voice or anything. I'm very moist.
I'm going to hit you with some David Lynch quotes here, you moist person. He had some thoughts. So David Lynch was asked what kind of reaction he wanted or expected people to have when Eraserhead would finally get shown to the public.
Okay.
And he said that he really wasn't thinking of an audience or what people would say or feel. Quote, "Angelo Badalamenti.
He said, Angelo Badalamenti. That was the end of the quote.
Eraserhead is Eraserhead, and it was meant to be just that way. And however people react to it is fine." And this is around the same time he was talking in the interview about how when he sees rubble and debris in kind of industrial environments, he sees beauty in that, going a long way to what we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Quote, "I love the idea that one thing can be different for different people. I like things that have a kernel of something in them. They have to be abstract. The more they are, the less likely this thing will happen. The maker has to feel it and know it in a certain way, and to be honest to it. I felt Eraserhead. I didn't think it. It was a quiet process, going from inside me to the screen. I'd get something on film, get it paced a certain way, add the right sounds, and then I'd be able to say if it worked or not. Abstract things are important to film, but very few people get the chance to really go all out with cinema. Creations are an extension of yourself, and you go out on a limb whenever you create anything. It's a risk." So that was a bit of a piecemeal of a few different things he said around that same quoted portion, but all speaking to that idea of how he views the creative process with regards to abstraction. Any particular things stand out about that to you?
Not at the moment, no. I think that it does genuinely feel... It feels like, as helpful as is, a David Lynch response.
Right. I think, again, more that idea that he has to find that kernel, that center of it, and then build from that center, and that he wants people to come away with different ideas and different thoughts.
Yes.
He doesn't want homogeny out of the responses. He adds on to that with regards to the creative process.
Yes.
Quote, "A film isn't finished until it's finished. Anything can come along and you realize that it's almost like the thing knows how it will be one day. Will the person discover those other things? The only way is to stay in there and be watchful and feel it. And maybe they'll pop into your conscious mind. But they've always been there somewhere." This one I think is interesting because the way he speaks of ideas, we talked about this with the Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, the wind idea.
Yes.
That it's almost as if he's describing that the ideas are already in your mind or in you somewhere or in the air, right? And you have to tap into those things. And the longer you can stay in that zone, the more you can connect to that. There's always that chance for these sort of happy accidents and scenarios to just sort of happen.
Okay.
That if you're in the right mindset, you'll notice, like the lady in the radiator thing. You know, he just happened to doodle it, then look at the radiator, saw the little box, and it connected. But if he would have rushed to finish Eraserhead and didn't take 4 or 5 years, he might not have found all the things that it was to become.
You say rush, but at the same time, a lot of this did not seem like it could be rushed.
Rushed in his opinion, maybe.
Perhaps.
That he needed to give the idea its full time to go to fruition.
Okay.
It makes you wonder then if there's other Lynch films that he didn't have as much time on, if he feels like he would have had a much better product over time.
Mm-hmm. Like Twin Peaks with Laura Palmer.
Like, yeah,
Killer.
not having himself have enough control over that, right? Right?
Time.
We've talked a bit before about the sort of fear of fatherhood, and we've hinted at the biographical, but I guess biological as well, element of the film with David Lynch's personal life.
Yes.
That he had that child at the same time. So there's plenty of thoughts on this. David Lynch outright denies that this is all of it, because he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that if it really was just the divorce or having the kid, then there would be thousands of films like Eraserhead. He said that isn't all there is, that there's got to be more to it than that for this to really make sense. So he pretty much rejects that idea. Jennifer Lynch, however, from what I was reading, she actually does think that she was the reason for Eraserhead, basically. So Jennifer Lynch was born out of an unexpected pregnancy. She was not a planned-for child.
Okay.
And she was born with a birth defect. So she was born with, as she put it, severely clubbed feet.
Okay.
So she does think that her birth was one of the main contributing factors, if not the main contributing factor, for Eraserhead.
Okay.
An unexpected baby that wasn't the way you expected it to be.
Okay.
I don't know. Just think that's, again, interesting that that's what supposedly Jennifer Lynch has thought. Indeed.
That's.
Things to chew on.
Dude, yeah, I'm chewing. I'm chewing.
Upon releasing Eraserhead, David Lynch called this film a, quote, dream of dark and troubling things. When he was asked in 1979 during an interview if he wanted to expound on that a little bit, Lynch said no. When asked if Henry is the dreamer or is he being dreamed, he also just didn't want to give an answer to that.
Neat.
So do you agree with the idea that Eraserhead is a dream of dark and troubling things?
Yes.
That's a pretty apt description.
It is very apt. I think that there are multiple moments that you could say, yep, that's that.
The same interview, I think it was this one, he made a comment that David Lynch is kind of a strange person. And David Lynch says, no, I'm not really that strange of a person at all. He says, but within each person's subconscious, there are, quote, denizens of the deep. And how basically Eraserhead, for a lot of people, is a very subconscious film, sort of like a dream. He himself isn't necessarily strange, but he kind of is tapping into something he thinks that people just in general have.
I think this is the exact response a strange person would give.
Yeah, it is really, isn't it? Now, this is something that I think people who know Eraserhead pretty well have probably been waiting for us to bring up at some point.
Okay.
It's kind of infamous. So, 2 back-to-back things here.
Go for it.
In 2006, David Lynch's book, The Catching the Big Fish, came out. And in it, he said, Eraserhead is my most spiritual movie. No one understands when I say that, but it is.
No one
so
understands
it's kind of a meme.
Dad.
It's kind of a meme for David Lynch is that he'll say Eraserhead's his most spiritual movie and never explain why or how. Now, another thing that's kind of famous here, this quote, basically during a time where he was having trouble putting together Eraserhead.
Okay.
Quote, I got out my Bible and I started reading. And one day I read a sentence and I closed the Bible because that was it. That was it. And then I saw the thing as a whole and it fulfilled this vision for me 100%. So Lynch has said numerous times he doesn't think he's ever going to reveal what the Bible verse was, but he has been adamant for decades that there is one verse in the Bible that holds the key for Eraserhead.
Great.
That basically, he saw this verse of the Bible and knew everything what was going on.
Excellent. That's great. Luckily, there's not that many verses in what was it called again? The Bible?
So, what do you make of Eraserhead being his most spiritual film? I know you haven't seen his other films yet, but that it's his most spiritual film, and that he ultimately completed this with a single verse of the Bible.
I think that, again, it makes it all the more of a personal work. I think when it comes to spiritualism, you are oftentimes giving forward your own spirit, this overall tag that is very much uniquely yours at the moment. So,
Do you read Eraserhead for yourself as a spiritual film?
I think people read spiritualism as well as spiritual values as something that is intrinsically based on life itself. And when you put life into film, I think that is when you come out with something like art. So, yeah, I can see it. I absolutely can see it, because this in its own self, as I've kind of described for myself, is somewhat of that moving art picture, that moving gallery.
So any movie is spiritual movie, or just
any film can be spiritual, not all, depending on how it is.
Is
either
the
presented or
Muppet
handled.
movie a spiritual movie?
Maybe to some,
Is it to you?
and I haven't seen it.
What movies are spiritual to you?
Six String Samurai.
Any others?
I think that's the only one that really connects to me most.
Okay. So you take spiritual to mean deep personal connection.
I think that it's deep personal connection that can guide oneself in one way or another. In this case, it oftentimes guides me in my own sense of writing, as well as my own sense of what I desire from life. And usually something like a mold like Six String Samurai is what I usually end up seeking and craving. So I think that becomes my own form. I may be butchering an idea.
Well, I think your idea of spiritual is a bit different, at least
Yes.
from what I interpret Lynch to mean here, is that
Probably.
I think he takes spiritual to be much more specific to not necessarily religion only,
Yeah.
but the idea of something transcendental or something for the soul. Eraserhead notably came out around the time that David Lynch began performing transcendental meditation like daily,
Yeah.
as well as an adoption of a vegetarian diet, stopping smoking and drinking for a while there. I know he definitely was a smoker later on again, so I'm not sure how long that lasted, but there was a period here of spirituality from what I was gathering. That makes me a little curious. In terms of spirituality, I mean, I don't really know how I feel on it, because I think, again, I brought up the idea of God and the machine potentially with the man and the planet.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I do view this as a more personal story about fatherhood, anxieties, and secrets. And I tend to not view it as a spiritual allegory necessarily.
Okay.
And the movie that I get the most spiritual element, I guess, if I had to call it that, from Lynch would be Inland Empire. But that's more the fear of demons in my soul. So that's a different kind of spiritual.
You don't fear demons in your soul when you look at Henry?
No. Inland Empire is extra hard mode.
Ah! The Dark Souls of Lynch.
It's the Dark Souls of David Lynch. I'm gonna say it. One area also of ambiguity in this movie is even genre. We mentioned before how the grandmother was very hard to place for genre at like film competitions and such, and film showings. What genre would you primarily call Eraserhead?
Sci-fi,
Is this a
Horror.
meme, or is it mainly sci-fi?
thriller, mystery, comedy,
If you had to pick one,
action.
it's not an action movie. What's the main label? You were the manager at a video store in the 90s, okay, and you had a VHS copy of Eraserhead. You only have like genre categories.
Gotcha.
What aisle do you put this on?
Trash.
You just throw it in the trash
Just,
can?
I'm not dealing with that.
No, what
That's
would you
too
do?
much.
I'd put it under horror. If I had to put it in one category, it'd be weird to put it in comedy.
Yeah.
It's not an action movie. It's not a family movie, although I guess it's kind of a family movie.
It'll eternally be in the new release section.
It's
just
always
because
a new
I cannot-
release.
I cannot move it.
I mean, I don't know if it fits into one of those categories very easily.
No.
You could argue drama. You could argue it is a drama.
I argue drama over horror, even though there's horror elements throughout.
I think the effect is more horrifying than dramatic, but I mean, there's a blurring.
I think that the effects are horrifying, but I do think that the overall story is something of a very personal, emotional, focusing on oneself.
Now, David Lynch, he describes the first half of the film as being an especially strange black comedy.
Okay.
So he does think of the first half of the film as comedy, but he also says that it has to be a very specific kind of comedy in order for it to switch into fear. So he does view it as a comedy that switches into fear.
Yep, not horror. disappear.
Yes, very distinct, very distinct. So kind of just like looking at all this then, if we were to summarize what this movie is about in like one sentence each. Let's do one sentence each. We want to go first or second?
I'll go first because everyone's going to hear the same thing again and again and again and again. Man just tries to hide a miserable pile of secrets. Backfires.
Okay. Good.
That's two sentences. Unless, like, is it one
like
sentence and one
semicolon
word?
was used. You used a semicolon in there.
Sure.
Don't worry
You're the
about it.
wordsmith here.
Don't worry about it. I would say a man feels like he is losing his sense of self as he has trouble deciding what to do or what not to do about unexpected developments in his life.
Man, that was a marathon of a sentence.
That was not that long.
That was
like a couple clauses.
There was a point in which, like, I had to, like, stop myself. I had to take myself a little bit of a drink break, watch as some runners ran ahead of me, but kind of continued because I had to finish off the race somehow.
I do think of this film as being similar to The Grandmother in a sense of that sort of anxiety about the parenting, except the difference being here that it's less about the child coping with an abusive environment and more about the dad just murdering the kid. But the idea of the father attacking the child, the mother more of the whimpering character in the background, but both ultimately just done with this kid. It is kind of a persisting idea between the two works.
Oh, no.
I don't know. It's interesting fertile ground for narrative.
Either way, Grandmother as well as Eraserhead doesn't really end up on a high note.
I mean, yeah, both have really dark endings.
Yep.
I would argue. I mean, I guess you could read them as happy. They're both ambiguous endings. I certainly don't read them as happy.
Yay.
Yay. So, now I bet you're wondering, did Eraserhead's financial and critical legacy have a happy ending?
No.
Let me tell you about that one.
The answer's no.
So, January 1977 review of Eraserhead was published by Variety, the magazine, and called it, quote, a sickening bad taste exercise, which, quote, pulls out all the gory stops in an unwatchable climax. The mind boggles to learn that Lynch labored on this picture for 5 years. Boom, roasted.
Yep, luckily in the future, we'll never have to worry about any productions as long, if not more, of 5 years that would end up flopping.
And Lynch will never have that problem with critics calling his work dark, depraved, violent, or in some way, like, unwatchable.
Nope, he is a clean, sanitized human being. Everything's okay.
Doing the clean.
I only experienced him with, like, again, minor due knowledge. This film, short films, and Twin Peaks. So I don't know his history with people.
But even Fire Walk With Me is enough to prove that this is going to happen again.
Yeah.
Now, like Fire Walk With Me, though, it definitely has a positive view nowadays.
Yeah, in Japan, maybe?
In Everywhere Land.
Oh, Everywhere Land.
So
my favorite place.
Eraserhead currently, according to my trivia, though I did not verify this, holds a 90% certified fresh rating from Rotten Tomatoes based on 40 reviews. That might be more or less depending on when you look at this.
Yeah.
This movie has been pretty much cited by a lot of creators as being very influential for them. Two creators in particular, John Waters, famous for movies such as Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, and Stanley Kubrick, famous for such films as 2001: A Space Odyssey and Eyes Wide Shut, have mentioned it as being one of their favorite films, to the extent that Kubrick reportedly has also in the past, well, he's not doing it anymore, required the cast and crew of The Shining to watch Eraserhead before shooting, to kind of get them in the mood.
A mood, certainly.
Which, you've seen The Shining. Would you believe then that the crew was told to watch Eraserhead?
Didn't the kid make it out alive?
Yes.
Then
spoilers? No. I don't know. Maybe spoilers. Who knows? Mel Brooks saw it, and that is kind of famously how David Lynch got to direct The Elephant Man, is that Mel Brooks kind of vouched for that and pushed for that.
Well, Mel Brooks is the guy behind, like, Spaceballs, Robin Hood Men in Tights, that
Blazing Saddles.
Blazing Saddles,
Yeah.
History of the World Part 1.
Yes, that same Mel Brooks, I believe. I don't know all of those, but yes.
Yes.
At least half of those.
Yes.
If not all halves.
Yes.
All three halves.
Producers? No, I don't think that was Mel Brooks. But yes.
I think it might have been based on something with Mel Brooks. That sounds kind of familiar, being involved with him. Anyway, George Lucas famously saw Eraserhead and asked David Lynch to direct Star Wars Return of the Jedi.
What?
Yeah. David Lynch almost directed Star Wars. It sounds fake, but this is actually a thing. I don't know if there's ever been like a lot detailing like what happened here, but Lynch basically chose Dune kind of instead. You want to think of it that way, you can. That's probably oversimplifying it, but
So I just want to make this straight. It was
Yeah.
after specifically Eraserhead
I would assume,
that he decided that, yes, this man is fit for Star Wars.
from what I was reading, yes.
Then we know for a fact now that there could have been the conception with Jar Jar Binks.
I mean, David Lynch had one other film out by that time,
Yeah.
which would be The Elephant Man, released in 1980. So it's between Eraserhead and The Elephant Man, I guess, depending on when George Lucas originally asked David Lynch.
I don't know the Elephant Man, so I'm just going to assume that
It's not
the child
as
Jar Jar.
It's not as much as Eraserhead.
'Kay.
Much, you can assume what adjective you want after the much,
Farewell.
but it's not as much blank as Eraserhead. Swiss surrealist H.R. Giger, who we've mentioned before in passing. I mentioned Giger more in passing, parenthetically, if you will, through referencing Darkseid 2 in particular. Before.
Yes.
We talked about what a Twin Peaks or David Lynch game would look like. I mentioned Darkseid. So H.R. Giger has stated that cited this being one of the greatest films he's ever seen. According to Giger, David Lynch declined to collaborate with him on Dune, though. He wanted to work with David Lynch on Dune because David Lynch supposedly had felt that Giger had stolen his ideas.
Oh.
So if that's to be believed, if Giger's to be believed about this, Lynch looked at Giger's artwork and saw it as stealing his ideas. H.R. Giger is largely notable for being kind of the inspiration for the designs of the xenomorphs in Alien, which, if you're looking at the xenomorphs and you're looking at that kind of art style versus the alien baby and Eraserhead, I could see parallels, I could see similarities, but I don't know. Again, I tend to be generally more lax / anti-intellectual property to a certain extent. So I'm kind of saying work with it, use it. It's fine. I think riffing on it's fine. Especially if you're giving credit to Lynch, you're saying he's a big influence. I don't know. That's my beans.
Shame on you.
And then I'm going to end here on some thoughts with Catherine Coulson and David Lynch on Eraserhead, their thoughts on the film. As I'm losing my voice, rapidly dying. So when Eraserhead debuted, Catherine Coulson's brother came to see it with his 7 children. And for large portions of the movie, he would have to put his arm over the eyes of the kids, which I don't know, 7 kids.
How far is this
How long
wingspan?
is this arm? It's a Space Jam scenario, right? And we found a quadruple feature opportunity. Watch Eraserhead with Osmosis Jones, with Brazil, with Space Jam.
Yep.
Quadruple feature.
All
the similar films.
All of the flavors of ice cream
All
that
the
were necessary.
Neapolitan Venn diagram.
Neapolitan has 3 flavors, not 4.
Anyway, he put his arm over the kid's eyes. And after he watched the movie, he told Catherine Coulson that she could have told him. But she said that to her, she didn't really think of it that way. To her, it was just a simple love story. She was so used to the movie by this point that she didn't even think, oh yeah, maybe don't bring your 7 kids to this.
These 7 children will never sleep again.
Oh, come on. Depending on the age of these kids see way worse.
I don't think I can sleep tonight.
I have a friend of mine who, like, he would talk about how when he was like 8 or so was like getting into the Silent Hill games, and it's just like when I was 8, seeing anything from Silent Hill gave me nightmares. But he was like diving into them and like really getting into them and stuff.
Yeah, but these are 7 separate minds. 1 to 7 childs will never sleep again.
I mean, statistically, some of these kids are never going to sleep. I agree with you on that. And then when asked for the 1997 book Lynch on Lynch what he, David Lynch, thought of Eraserhead,
Okay.
he answered, quote, "Well, for some time, we had to look at some new prints of Eraserhead a couple of years after it was finished. And I was in a different sort of place and able to just relax and see it. And the film was over. I said, it's a perfect film." And then it says laughs. I don't know how to do a David Lynch laugh. That's good. I'm going to go with that. That's the only time I've ever said that about anything I've done. I was just really happy with it on that one day.
Mm-hmm.
So at least one time, David Lynch watched Eraserhead and said it was a perfect film.
That's a good record.
That's a good record. I don't know if he still feels that way now, but he definitely looks at Eraserhead with fond memories and views it as one of his better films, it sounds like.
Good for him.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that's Eraserhead.
Yeah, it was Eraserhead.
Yeah.
We talked about the baby.
Talked about the baby. Before my voice goes out entirely, I have two wonderful and strange questions of the week for you.
Okay.
Professor, do you feel yourself ready for them?
No. Is that that you asked the question? Good. Okay,
That's not
your
one
first
of
question.
Don't pull a genie on me. Don't pull an Aladdin 1992 genie on me. Listeners, don't fact check if it was 92 or not.
Just do it anyway, and while you're at it, watch Thief and the Cobbler.
So my first wonderful and strange question of the week. Take this however you want. How do you think Eraserhead would be as a film if it was in color and not black and white? This whole movie was in color.
I think it would be way less effective. I think that using the imagination and allowing everything to be dulled out just so that you're hyper-focused on the brightness and the darkness of it is one of the biggest benefits to the film. I think that it is almost necessary for the overall feel of this, at least, specific film.
What if we had, instead of the red room, in Twin Peaks, what if it was just a black and white room? Would that have been more effective then?
Do we just call it the gray room then?
Yeah. What if instead of the red curtains and chevron, it was more of the black and white with the chevron?
No, it wouldn't fit. I
Okay.
think that there is a need for color whenever it comes for, especially the beautiful, lush ends of nature itself.
The nature of red curtains.
The nature of nature, and where we're brought into the juxtaposition of something black, white, and red.
Mm-hmm.
I think that these very striking, bold colors with the overall just mush of nature
Okay.
is almost necessary for that form itself.
Okay.
Obviously, I live in a reality that neither of these opposing ends exist.
Sure.
But
I mean, we could very easily take the footage of the red room and make it black and white.
We could.
Photo editing, video editing programs that do that.
we could. I just think that there are certain points where you kind of pull your cards, where you put your aces in your places.
Okay. Then my last wonderful and strange question of the week, Professor. After watching Eraserhead,
I did.
how has watching Eraserhead shaped your views on David Lynch as an artist?
As far as an artist in general,
Yes. However you want to take this, really.
okay. As an artist in general, it shows a heavy amount, especially knowing the things in the background. It shows a heavy amount of dedication to the craft that is very, not only like a breath of not necessarily fresh air, but familiar air. That I am just, again, thoroughly impressed by his ability, not only to create something, but also bring other people in enough to convince them that this needs to be made,
Yes.
despite all other obstacles. I think that, again, the physicality of a lot of the scenes is very impressive for what moods it needs to be. But moods are necessary.
What nudes are necessary?
No nudes were necessary in
Sound
the
like you
making
said
of this
that to
film.
me.
Moods.
Moods.
Moods like the cow, but with the DS.
The Nintendo cow.
The Nintendo cow. And I look forward to seeing how that may morph, mold, and shape in the future, whether it is Twin Peaks adjacent or not.
Very well, very well. Next up, we're looking at some Twin Peaks material, I believe, right?
It'll be Twin Peaks regardless. Look forward to Twin Peaks on this Twin Peaks Logcast.
And after that, we're looking at more David Lynch films. Starting off next, after the next episode, we're going to next look at The Elephant Man,
Ooh.
the movie that Mel Brooks vouched Lynch to create that may or may not have almost got David Lynch to direct a Star Wars movie.
That may or may not have elephants or man.
It doesn't have Jack Nance, though.
Aw,
That's sad.
as is sad.
I really liked last time, Professor, where we ended the podcast. I don't know if it was last time. It was the time before last time. We ended the podcast on a rendition of Mares Dotes.
Okay.
Do you think it's fitting that we end this episode on a rendition of In Heaven, Everything is Fine?
If you want to go musically when it's about 1 a.m. for our neighbors, by all means.
You don't have to do it loud. Let's do an ASMR version.
Okay, very well.
Okay, so I'm gonna do a little countdown over here with my hand fingies.
In heaven, everything is fine. In heaven, everything is fine.
You've got your things, and I've got mine. Look at my knees!